On September 14, 2022, in New Orleans, Louisiana, 17-year-old Keith Duncan was stabbed to death in the parking lot of the Riverwalk Shopping Center, one of the city's most upscale malls. The killer, 17-year-old Jeffrey Blake, attacked Keith as he was returning to his car after an afternoon of shopping, stabbing him multiple times in what began as a robbery attempt, but quickly escalated when Keith recognized his attacker and fought back. Keith's body was discovered by a mall security guard making routine rounds shortly after 7 p.m., slumped beside his car in a pool of blood, his expensive watch and gold chain conspicuously missing. The brutal murder shocked the affluent Garden District community where both teenagers lived just blocks apart, their paths crossing in a fatal encounter that would forever change two families and leave a city wondering how such violence could erupt between two young men with seemingly bright futures ahead. Before we dive deeper into this tragic case, I'd like to ask you to subscribe if you're interested in more true crime analyses like this one. Where are you watching from today? The support from viewers like you helps us continue to bring these important stories to light. Jeffrey Blake had been watching Keith Duncan for nearly an hour inside the mall, stalking him from store to store while keeping a careful distance, his eyes fixed on the gleaming watch adorning Keith's wrist. The mall's security cameras would later reveal the calculated nature of Jeffrey's movements, how he lingered outside high-end stores as Keith shopped, how he maintained his distance until Keith headed for the exit, and how he followed him into the dimly lit section of the parking garage where fewer cameras monitored the area. New Orleans police would later determine that Jeffrey had specifically targeted Keith for the designer watch and gold chain he wore, items valued at over $15,000, but had not anticipated that Keith would recognize him from their neighborhood and fight back with unexpected ferocity. What began as a premeditated robbery quickly spiraled into a desperate, violent struggle when Keith, realizing who his attacker was, landed several powerful punches that left Jeffrey bleeding and panicked. The parking garage of the Riverwalk Shopping Center sits perched along the Mississippi River, its upper levels offering views of the murky waters that have witnessed centuries of the city's darkest moments. On that warm September evening, as tourists wandered nearby Bourbon Street and locals sought respite from the lingering summer heat, few would have noticed the teenage boy trailing another through the garage's concrete labyrinth. The surveillance cameras captured Jeffrey's face clearly as he pulled his hoodie up moments before approaching Keith, his hand already reaching for the knife concealed in his pocket. The cameras also captured Keith's shocked expression of recognition, the moment he called Jeffrey by name, asking what he was doing, before realizing the danger he was in. The subsequent struggle lasted less than 2 minutes, but would change the trajectory of both young lives forever, one ending in death, the other condemned to decades behind bars. The altercation was brutal and chaotic, with Keith initially gaining the upper hand as his athletic build and quick reflexes allowed him to land several powerful blows that left Jeffrey with a broken nose and split lip. Blood evidence later collected from the scene would confirm that Keith had managed to injure Jeffrey significantly before the knife was drawn, supporting witness statements that described hearing shouts and the sounds of a struggle. Jeffrey, overwhelmed by Keith's unexpected resistance and panicking at being recognized, pulled out a 7-inch hunting knife he had concealed in his jacket. The medical examiner would later count 11 stab wounds across Keith's chest, abdomen, and arms, indicating a frenzied attack far beyond what would have been necessary to facilitate a simple robbery. As Keith collapsed to the ground, security camera footage showed Jeffrey quickly removing the watch from Keith's wrist and tearing the gold chain from his neck before fleeing the scene, leaving Keith to bleed out alone between parked cars. New Orleans has long been a city where beauty and violence dance in uncomfortable proximity, where the ornate wrought-iron balconies of the French Quarter cast shadows over alleys where crimes unfold nightly. The Riverwalk Shopping Center represented the city's aspirational side, clean, modern, and exclusive, a stark contrast to the poverty that plagued many neighborhoods just a few miles away. Both Keith and Jeffrey had grown up in this dichotomy, attending the same middle school years earlier before their paths diverged in high school. Keith to a private academy on scholarship, Jeffrey to the struggling public school with metal detectors at its entrances. Detective Noah Brown, a 20-year veteran of the New Orleans Police Department's Homicide Division, would later tell reporters that this case exemplified the city's ongoing struggle with class divisions and opportunity gaps. Brown had seen countless young men make fatal decisions over far less valuable items than a $15,000 watch, but the personal connection between victim and killer added a layer of tragedy that haunted even his seasoned investigative team. The Riverwalk's extensive security system would prove invaluable to investigators, providing high-definition footage of Jeffrey's movements throughout the mall and into the parking garage. The cameras had captured him noticing Keith at the food court, adjusting his path to follow at a distance, and the calculating way he observed the expensive watch when Keith reached for his wallet. Most damning was the footage showing Jeffrey deliberately choosing not to exit through the main entrance, but instead following Keith to the more isolated section of the parking garage. The premeditation, evident in the footage, would later become central to the prosecution's case, undermining defense claims that the encounter was coincidental or that the violence erupted spontaneously. Detective Brown, reviewing the footage in the hours after the crime, immediately recognized the deliberate stalking behavior and ordered his team to identify the suspect, knowing the clear images would make identification a matter of when, not if. As night fell over New Orleans, the crime scene in the parking garage was transformed into a clinical workspace of forensic technicians and detectives. The humid September air made the scent of blood more pronounced as investigators worked methodically under portable lights, collecting evidence that would eventually lead them to Jeffrey Blake. Keith's car remained where he had parked it, his shopping bags still sitting in the trunk he had opened moments before being attacked. Among the items purchased that day was a birthday gift for his younger sister, a charm bracelet from a high-end jeweler that would never be given. The irony was not lost on Detective Brown that Keith had died for his valuables while in possession of a gift meant to celebrate another life. The violence of the attack was evident in the blood spatter patterns that forensic technicians photographed and measured, telling the story of a struggle that moved several feet across the parking area before ending where Keith's body was found. The parking garage cameras had captured Jeffrey's escape route as he fled down a service stairwell, exiting onto a side street that connected to the city's streetcar line. Additional traffic cameras would later confirm that Jeffrey had boarded a streetcar heading toward the neighborhood where both he and Keith lived, his hoodie pulled low over his face, but not enough to prevent identification. The New Orleans streetcar, an iconic symbol of the city's charm and history, had unwittingly transported a killer away from his crime scene, its antique wooden seats absorbing the blood from Jeffrey's own injuries sustained during the struggle with Keith. Investigators would later recover blood samples from the streetcar that matched Jeffrey's DNA, creating an irrefutable timeline of his movements following the murder. The city's extensive surveillance network, installed in response to post-Katrina crime waves, had created a digital trail that would make denying his presence impossible. Within hours of Keith's body being discovered, his identity was confirmed through his driver's license, and detectives made the solemn journey to the Duncan family home in the Garden District. The Victorian-style house with its manicured lawn represented the success of Keith's parents. His father, a successful contractor, his mother an administrator at Tulane University, and stood in sharp contrast to the public housing complex where Jeffrey Blake lived with his grandmother less than a mile away. The notification of death is a moment that homicide detectives universally dread, and the screams of Keith's mother when told of her son's murder echoed through the elegant foyer of their home, startling the family's pet birds into a frantic flutter of wings. Keith's 13-year-old sister, Lisa, had been doing homework in the kitchen when the detectives arrived, and her silent collapse upon hearing the news would later be described by Detective Brown as one of the most heartbreaking reactions he had witnessed in his career. The news of Keith Duncan's murder spread quickly through New Orleans, a city already too familiar with violence, yet still capable of being shocked by its senselessness. Local news stations broadcast Keith's yearbook photo alongside grainy images from the mall's security cameras showing an unidentified suspect, asking the public for information while warning shoppers to remain vigilant. The Riverwalk Shopping Center, eager to protect its reputation as a safe retail destination, issued statements highlighting their security measures and cooperation with police. By morning, flowers and candles had begun to appear near the entrance to the parking garage, the beginning of an impromptu memorial that would grow over the coming days. Keith's private school announced counseling services for students and a moment of silence before classes, while social media filled with tributes to the popular teenager whose smile and generosity had touched many lives. The brutal killing represented more than just another statistic in New Orleans' troubled relationship with violent crime. It highlighted how even privileged youth weren't immune to the city's underlying tensions. Local commentators noted that the shopping center where Keith died sat at the intersection of wealth and poverty that characterized much of New Orleans, its luxury stores and restaurants standing in stark contrast to neighborhoods still struggling to recover from Hurricane Katrina nearly 2 decades earlier. Jeffrey Blake had grown up in one such neighborhood, raised by his grandmother after his mother's incarceration for drug offenses, his father long absent from his life. The paths of the two teenagers had crossed years earlier in middle school before the city's stratified education system separated them, Keith to opportunity, Jeffrey to an environment where violence and crime often seemed like the only available options. This context, while not excusing the murder, provided a backdrop that many residents recognized as part of the city's ongoing struggle with inequality. Keith Duncan was more than just a victim. He was a 17-year-old high school senior with dreams of attending Tulane University to study engineering, following in the footsteps of his mother's academic career. Friends described him as thoughtful and driven, the kind of student who tutored others without being asked, and who had managed to balance academic excellence with being genuinely well-liked by his peers. His bedroom, which police would photograph as part of their investigation, told the story of his passions. Shelves lined with science competition trophies, walls covered with posters of New Orleans Saints football players, and a desk meticulously organized with college applications in various stages of completion. The designer watch that had caught Jeffrey Blake's attention was not a symbol of frivolous spending, but a graduation gift from his parents, celebrating Keith's early acceptance to Tulane and his perfect SAT scores, an achievement that represented countless hours of dedicated study and the promise of a bright future. The Duncan family home in the Garden District stood as a testament to generational progress, purchased by Keith's grandfather, who had built a successful contracting business after returning from military service in Vietnam. Keith's father had expanded the business, and Keith had spent summers working alongside the construction crews, learning the value of hard work while developing the muscular build that had allowed him to briefly fight off his attacker. The gold chain that was stolen from his body had been a gift from his grandfather on his 16th birthday, making its theft not just a material loss, but the severing of a family connection that had special meaning. Keith's younger sister, Lisa, idolized her brother, often telling friends that she wanted to be as smart as Keith when she reached high school, unaware that her brother privately told others that she was the truly gifted one in the family. Their relationship was unusually close for teenage siblings, with Keith often adjusting his own schedule to drive Lisa to her dance classes or to help with her science projects. At Marshall Preparatory Academy, the private school Keith attended on partial scholarship, teachers spoke of a young man who defied stereotypes by being both intellectually gifted and socially adept. His calculus teacher, in a statement to police, recalled how Keith had organized study groups for struggling classmates before exams, refusing payment even when offered. The school's basketball coach noted that while Keith wasn't a starter on the team, his dedication to improvement and his ability to motivate teammates had made him an essential part of their successful season. The yearbook staff had already selected Keith to be featured in the Most Likely to Succeed section of the upcoming senior edition, a designation that now carried a heartbreaking irony. A collection of college acceptance letters found in Keith's desk drawer revealed options beyond Tulane, including offers from Georgia Tech and MIT, evidence of a future full of possibility that had been violently extinguished in a parking garage over material possessions. The $15,000 designer watch that had caught Jeffrey Blake's attention represented more than just its monetary value in the Duncan family narrative. Keith had admired the watch in a magazine for months before his early college acceptance, pointing it out to his parents but never asking for such an expensive gift. When his father's business landed a major contract to help rebuild a historic theater in the French Quarter, his parents had secretly purchased the watch, seeing it as both a reward for Keith's academic achievements and an investment piece that would serve him throughout his professional life. Security camera footage from the mall on the day of the murder showed Keith checking the time on this watch repeatedly, unaware that its gleaming surface had caught the attention of someone with deadly intentions. The watch, designed to be passed down through generations, would instead become evidence in a murder case, its serial number helping to connect the stolen item found in Jeffrey's bedroom to its rightful owner. Keith's social media accounts, reviewed by detectives seeking insights into any possible connection with his killer, revealed a teenager with a wide circle of friends and a life centered around family, school, and community service. His Instagram feed showed him volunteering at post-hurricane cleanup efforts, celebrating basketball victories with teammates, and posing proudly beside his sister at her dance recitals. There were no signs of involvement with drugs or gangs, no concerning relationships or threatening messages that might have foreshadowed violence. Several posts showed Keith with his arm around his sister Lisa, their resemblance striking in their shared smile and bright eyes that reflected the Duncan family's tight bonds. A video posted just 3 days before his murder showed Keith teaching Lisa how to drive in an empty parking lot, both of them laughing as she stalled the car repeatedly. The comment section was filled with friends teasing Keith about his patience and Lisa about her driving skills, the ordinary teenage interaction now preserved as a final digital memory of their relationship. New Orleans had lost not just a promising young life, but a future community leader whose early commitments to service suggested he would have continued his family's tradition of investing in the city. Keith had already accumulated over 300 hours of community service during high school, far exceeding the requirements for graduation, with much of his time dedicated to tutoring elementary school students in mathematics at a community center not far from where Jeffrey Blake lived. In a cruel twist that investigators would later note, Keith had likely encountered Jeffrey during these tutoring sessions years earlier, creating a tenuous connection between victim and killer that neither acknowledged at the time of the murder. Keith's phone, recovered from his pocket at the crime scene, contained text messages sent earlier that day discussing plans to organize a school supplies drive for underserved schools in the very neighborhood where Jeffrey lived, a final testament to his concern for addressing the inequities he recognized in his community. The loss of Keith Duncan resonated beyond his immediate family and school, touching the broader New Orleans community that had watched him grow from an eager child into a young man of promise. Local news coverage featured interviews with former teachers from his elementary years who remembered his curious nature and kind heart, alongside coaches from youth sports leagues who spoke of his team-first mentality. The pastor of the family's church recalled Keith's confirmation ceremony and his thoughtful questions about faith and service, describing him as a light in a city that often struggles with darkness. As details of the murder emerged, the sense of collective grief intensified, with many seeing in Keith's death not just the loss of an individual, but a symbolic blow to the city's hopes for its youth. A candlelight vigil held 2 days after the murder drew hundreds of attendees from across the socioeconomic spectrum of New Orleans, a rare moment of unity in a city often divided by race and class. Lisa Duncan, Keith's 13-year-old sister, became the emotional center of the family's grief, her youth making her loss all the more poignant to those following the case. In the days after the murder, she retreated into a profound silence that concerned the grief counselors working with the family, communicating only through written notes and refusing to enter the parts of the house most strongly associated with her brother. The charm bracelet Keith had purchased as her birthday gift, recovered from his shopping bags at the crime scene, was given to her by detectives with her parents' permission. A final gift that she would later wear to every court proceeding. Lisa's middle school principal described her as a bright, formerly vivacious student whose personality seemed to have been extinguished by her brother's death. The profound bond between the siblings had been severed at a crucial developmental stage for Lisa, and psychological professionals consulted by the family warned that the trauma might have long-lasting effects on her emotional development and ability to form trusting relationships. Keith's parents, Marcus and Evelyn Duncan, handled their grief with a dignity that impressed even the most seasoned detectives and prosecutors. In their first press conference, standing on the steps of their Garden District home with Lisa between them, they spoke not of vengeance but of justice, asking the community to trust the legal system and to honor their son's memory by rejecting further violence. Marcus Duncan, his contractor's hands gripping the podium with white-knuckled intensity, spoke of his son's belief in education as the path to overcoming societal divisions, while Evelyn, an administrator at Tulane University, announced the establishment of a scholarship in Keith's name for students from underserved communities. Their composure cracked only when describing the birthday gift Keith had purchased for Lisa, Evelyn's voice breaking as she detailed how her son had saved from his summer job to buy the perfect present for his sister. This public display of grief and resilience generated a wave of support for the family and increased pressure on police to bring Keith's killer to justice. The autopsy report, which became public during preliminary court proceedings, provided a clinical counterpoint to the emotional narratives surrounding Keith's life and death. The medical examiner documented 11 stab wounds with 3 penetrating vital organs, the most lethal piercing Keith's heart and causing rapid blood loss that would have rendered him unconscious within minutes. Defensive wounds on his hands and forearms indicated that he had fought vigorously to protect himself, with skin and blood samples under his fingernails matching Jeffrey Blake's DNA. The report noted Keith's excellent physical condition, his strong cardiovascular system and muscular development likely extending his survival time long enough that had someone discovered him immediately after the attack, emergency medical intervention might have saved his life. This detail added another layer of tragedy to the case, suggesting that had the parking garage been more populated at that hour, the outcome might have been different. The autopsy also revealed no alcohol or drugs in Keith's system, contradicting early defense suggestions that the confrontation might have involved a disputed drug deal. As investigators pieced together Keith Duncan's final day, they created a timeline that highlighted the random cruelty of his murder. That morning, he had helped his father measure a job site before attending classes, where he had presented his senior project on sustainable urban infrastructure to enthusiastic feedback from teachers. After school, he had driven to the Riverwalk Shopping Center with the specific purpose of buying Lisa's birthday gift, texting his mother pictures of different charm options before making his selection. Security cameras tracked his movements through the mall, showing him stopping at a sporting goods store to look at basketball shoes and eating a quick dinner at the food court, ordinary teenage activities that Jeffrey Blake had observed while formulating his plan to rob Keith. The mundane nature of Keith's activities on his final day underscored the senselessness of his murder, the random intersection of two young lives resulting in one extinguished and another forever altered by a decision made in a moment of greed. The 911 call came at 7:23 p.m. from a woman returning to her car after an evening yoga class at a studio adjacent to the Riverwalk Shopping Center. Her voice, captured on the recorded emergency line, trembled as she described a young man lying in a pool of blood between parked cars on the third level of the garage. "I think he's been stabbed," she told the dispatcher, explaining that she had approached after seeing what she initially thought was someone who had fallen but retreated when she realized the severity of the situation. The caller remained on the line until first responders arrived 6 minutes later, providing crucial information about the precise location within the sprawling parking structure while keeping her distance as instructed by the dispatcher. Her description of seeing no one else in the immediate vicinity suggested the attacker had fled sometime before the discovery, creating an immediate challenge for investigators trying to establish a timeline of the crime. First responders found Keith Duncan already deceased, his body showing signs that death had occurred at least 30 minutes before discovery, based on initial assessment of body temperature and blood coagulation. Officers immediately secured the area, establishing a wide perimeter that encompassed several levels of the parking garage to preserve potential evidence, while mall security provided immediate access to their surveillance system. Detective Noah Brown arrived on scene at 7:42 p.m., bringing with him the methodical approach that had earned him a reputation as one of the New Orleans Police Department's most thorough homicide investigators. His first actions, documented in police reports and later shared during court testimony, involved a careful assessment of the scene before anything was disturbed, noting the position of the body, the blood spatter patterns on nearby vehicles, and the victim's personal items strewn across the concrete. Brown's initial observations, recorded in his characteristic detailed shorthand, included the first mention of the missing watch, as a distinct tan line on the victim's wrist indicated a regularly worn item was absent. The mall security office became an impromptu command center as Detective Brown and his team reviewed footage from the extensive camera network that covered both the interior shopping areas and the parking structures. The digital security system, upgraded just 6 months earlier, provided high-definition video that clearly showed Keith's movements throughout the mall that afternoon, as well as those of the teenager who would later be identified as Jeffrey Blake. The breakthrough moment came when surveillance specialist Tamara Wilkins isolated footage showing Jeffrey noticing Keith at the food court, his attention clearly drawn to the watch visible when Keith checked the time on his phone. Subsequent footage showed Jeffrey following Keith at a distance through the mall, always maintaining enough separation to avoid detection, but never letting his target out of sight. The most damning sequence, which would later become central to the prosecution's case, showed Jeffrey deliberately adjusting his route to follow Keith to his car rather than exiting through the mall's main entrance, pulling up his hoodie as he entered the parking garage shortly after Keith. The foundational clue that would ultimately break the case came from the mall's security cameras positioned throughout the parking garage, capturing Jeffrey Blake following Keith Duncan to his car and the subsequent attack. The footage, while not showing the murder in its entirety due to camera angles and parked vehicles creating blind spots, clearly documented Jeffrey approaching Keith from behind as he opened his trunk, the initial confrontation, and Keith's evident recognition of his attacker before the physical struggle began. Most crucially, the cameras captured Jeffrey fleeing the scene afterward, his face briefly visible when he looked up while entering a stairwell, providing investigators with a clear image they could use for identification. Detective Brown, watching the footage in real time as security staff navigated through the system, immediately recognized the significance of these images, ordering copies preserved through proper evidence protocols while dispatching officers to follow the suspect's escape route through additional cameras in the area. The crime scene told a story of violent struggle that corroborated what the security footage had partially captured. Blood spatter analysis, conducted by forensic technician Marcus Jeffries, indicated that the confrontation had moved approximately 15 feet across the parking area, with drops and smears suggesting Keith had fought back vigorously before succumbing to his injuries. A trail of blood leading away from the scene initially suggested the perpetrator had also been injured. A theory later confirmed when DNA analysis matched this blood to Jeffrey Blake. Keith's car contained shopping bags with recently purchased items, including the charm bracelet intended for his sister's birthday. But his wallet remained in his back pocket with cash still inside, suggesting the killer had targeted specific items rather than taking everything of value. Most notable to investigators was the precision with which the watch and chain had been removed, the watch clasp unfastened rather than broken, indicating the killer had taken time to properly remove it, despite having just committed a violent murder. Detective Noah Brown, standing in the harsh fluorescent lighting of the parking garage as the medical examiner made preliminary assessments of Keith's body, recognized immediately that this case would require delicate handling beyond the technical aspects of the investigation. New Orleans had a troubled history with crimes crossing racial and socioeconomic lines, and Brown knew that a murder occurring at an upscale shopping center would generate significant media attention and community anxiety. Using his department-issued tablet, he pulled up Keith's driver's license information and noted the Garden District address, mentally preparing for the difficult notification he would soon make to the family. The detective assigned Officer Jasmine Williams, known for her compassionate approach to victims' families, to gather preliminary background on the Duncan family before the notification team arrived at their home. Brown's 20 years of experience had taught him that understanding the victim was as crucial as tracking the perpetrator, particularly in cases where the motive might involve personal connections rather than random violence. The medical examiner, Dr. Elaine Toussaint, conducted her preliminary examination at the scene, documenting the multiple stab wounds and defensive injuries before authorizing the body's removal to the coroner's office for full autopsy. Her initial assessment, shared verbally with Detective Brown and later formalized in her report, estimated the time of death between 6:45 p.m. and 7:15 p.m., creating a narrow window that aligned with the security footage timestamps. Dr. Toussaint noted the precision of several of the stab wounds, particularly the one that had penetrated Keith's heart, suggesting either training or luck on the part of the assailant. The defensive wounds on Keith's hands and forearms indicated he had attempted to block the knife attacks, consistent with the struggle seen in the security footage. Most significantly for the investigation, Dr. Toussaint identified tissue and blood under Keith's fingernails that likely belonged to his attacker, immediately ordering samples preserved for DNA analysis that would later provide a crucial link to Jeffrey Blake. While the on-scene investigation continued, Detective Brown dispatched officers to canvass the shopping center for potential witnesses who might have observed either Keith or his attacker before or after the murder. The timing of the crime, early evening on a Wednesday, meant the mall had been moderately busy, though the specific area of the parking garage where the attack occurred was relatively isolated. Several shoppers reported seeing a teenager matching Jeffrey's description moving quickly near the mall exits around the estimated time of the murder, with one witness noting that he appeared to have blood on his hands that he was attempting to wipe on his dark jeans. Mall employees from stores where Keith had shopped provided additional context for his movements prior to the attack, with the jewelry store clerk who had sold him the charm bracelet for his sister remembering him clearly because of his polite demeanor, and the story he had shared about his sister's upcoming birthday. These witness statements, while not providing direct observation of the crime itself, helped investigators construct a more complete timeline of events leading up to the fatal encounter. By midnight, barely 5 hours after Keith's body had been discovered, the New Orleans Police Department had compiled sufficient evidence to consider the case a targeted robbery-homicide rather than a random act of violence. The security footage clearly showed premeditation in the way Jeffrey Blake had followed Keith throughout the mall. The selective nature of the items taken from the body suggested specific targeting of valuables, and the level of violence indicated a crime that had escalated beyond the perpetrator's initial intentions. Detective Brown, in his preliminary report filed before leaving the scene, noted his working theory that the suspect likely knew or was familiar with the victim based on the victim's apparent recognition during the initial confrontation and the targeted nature of the items taken. This assessment would prove remarkably accurate as the investigation progressed, though the connection between the two teenagers would initially elude investigators focused on processing the extensive physical and digital evidence collected from the crime scene. The notification to the Duncan family occurred shortly before 10 p.m., with Detective Brown and Officer Williams arriving at the Garden District home where Keith had grown up. The detectives had confirmed through vehicle registration that the car in the parking garage belonged to Keith Duncan, and preliminary identification through his driver's license and school ID found in his wallet left little doubt about the victim's identity. Marcus Duncan answered the door, initially confused by the late visit until he recognized the solemn expressions that parents instinctively fear. The notification, documented in Officer Williams' report as one of the most difficult in my career, unfolded in the family's living room, where Keith's school portraits lined the walls chronologically, showing his growth from a smiling child to a poised young man. Evelyn Duncan collapsed upon hearing the news, while Lisa, who had come downstairs investigating the late-night visitors, stood frozen in the doorway as her world permanently shifted. Detective Brown, following department protocol for death notifications, provided only confirmed information about the location and general nature of Keith's death, explaining that the investigation was already underway while promising to keep the family updated as details emerged. The following morning, as dawn broke over New Orleans with the characteristic golden light that photographers love to capture, reflecting off the Mississippi River, the investigation entered a new phase focused on identifying the suspect clearly visible in the security footage. The department's digital evidence team had enhanced the clearest images of Jeffrey's face, distributing them internally while preparing for potential public release if identification wasn't quickly established. Detective Brown, operating on minimal sleep, met with school resource officers from both public and private high schools in the area, showing them the enhanced images in hopes that someone would recognize the teenager. The breakthrough came when Officer Terrence Jackson, assigned to Eleanor Roosevelt High School in Jeffrey's neighborhood, immediately identified the suspect as Jeffrey Blake, a junior with a record of minor offenses including shoplifting and fighting. Jackson provided crucial background information about Jeffrey's living situation with his grandmother, his absent parents, and his recent behavioral issues at school, creating the first comprehensive profile of the suspect and establishing a starting point for locating him. The formal identification of Jeffrey Blake as the primary suspect transformed the investigation, shifting focus from determining who had committed the crime to building an airtight case that would survive legal scrutiny. Detective Noah Brown, upon receiving confirmation of Jeffrey's identity from Officer Jackson, immediately initiated a background check that revealed a troubling progression of juvenile offenses, beginning with shoplifting at age 13 and escalating to more serious property crimes and fighting by age 16. Jeffrey's school records painted a picture of a student with above-average intelligence but poor attendance and disciplinary issues, with one teacher noting in a report that he seems angry at the world, while another described him as capable of charm when he wants something. Most significant for the investigation was the discovery that Jeffrey lived less than a mile from the Duncan family home, suggesting the possibility that he and Keith had crossed paths in the neighborhood, potentially explaining Keith's apparent recognition of his attacker as seen in the security footage. This geographical connection, combined with Jeffrey's history of property crimes, strengthened Brown's initial theory that the robbery had turned deadly when Keith recognized his attacker. Forensic analysis of the mall security footage provided investigators with a detailed timeline of Jeffrey Blake's actions before, during, and after the murder. The footage showed him entering the mall alone at 5:42 p.m., wearing dark jeans and a gray hoodie, initially browsing through stores without apparent purpose. At 6:13 p.m., cameras captured the moment when Jeffrey first noticed Keith in the food court, his attention visibly drawn to the watch on Keith's wrist when he checked the time on his phone. Subsequent footage documented Jeffrey's methodical stalking of Keith through the mall, always maintaining enough distance to avoid detection while keeping his target in sight. Video analyst Tamara Wilkins noted in her report how Jeffrey's body language changed after spotting Keith, becoming more focused and deliberate, his path through the mall no longer random but clearly tracking another shopper. The footage from 6:52 p.m. showed Keith exiting the mall toward the parking garage, with Jeffrey following approximately 30 seconds behind, pulling up his hoodie as he passed through the doors in an apparent attempt to conceal his identity from the cameras he likely knew were monitoring the exits. The parking garage cameras provided crucial evidence of premeditation, capturing Jeffrey following Keith up the ramp to the third level rather than exiting to the street, as would be expected if their paths crossing had been coincidental. These cameras showed Jeffrey accelerating his pace to close the distance between himself and Keith once they were in the more isolated environment of the parking structure, the most damning sequence, which prosecutor Ashley Martinez would later describe as the moment that removes all doubt about intent, showed Jeffrey reaching into his pocket and removing what appeared to be a knife, while still several car lengths behind Keith, clearly preparing for the confrontation before Keith had even reached his vehicle. This footage contradicted what would later become Jeffrey's initial claim that he had pulled the knife only in self-defense after Keith attacked him, establishing a timeline that showed the weapon was readied before any interaction between the two teenagers occurred. The careful documentation of these video timestamps would prove essential in refuting defense arguments and establishing first-degree murder charges rather than a lesser offense. Detective Brown, recognizing that identifying Jeffrey was only the first step in building a prosecutable case, focused on establishing a connection between the suspect and the stolen items. Working with Jeffrey's school records, Brown discovered that Jeffrey had been absent from classes on the day of the murder, but had attended the following day, suggesting he had not fled the area after committing the crime. This information led Brown to believe the stolen watch and chain might still be in Jeffrey's possession, potentially at his residence, providing grounds for a search warrant. Judge Marianne Collins, reviewing the evidence presented by Brown, including the clear security footage, Jeffrey's criminal history, and the geographic proximity to the victim, granted a warrant for Jeffrey's arrest and a search of his grandmother's home where he resided. The judge's comments, noted in court records, described the evidence as compelling and specific, authorizing the police action that would ultimately recover the stolen items and solidify the case against Jeffrey Blake. The tactical team that approached Loretta Blake's modest home in the early morning hours of September 16th, just 2 days after the murder, employed caution due to the violent nature of the crime they were investigating. Officer reports describe a coordinated entry at 5:45 a.m., with Jeffrey taken into custody while still in bed, offering no resistance beyond initial confusion. Jeffrey's grandmother, awakened by the commotion, repeatedly asked what was happening as officers secured the premises and explained the warrant. Detective Brown, who had remained outside until the residence was secured, entered to find a visibly shaken Jeffrey already in handcuffs, wearing only boxer shorts and a T-shirt, his expression shifting from confusion to resignation as Brown explained he was being arrested in connection with the murder of Keith Duncan. The teenager's lack of surprise at the specific charge was noted by Brown in his report, interpreting it as potential consciousness of guilt that Jeffrey seemed unsurprised about which crime had brought police to his door. The search of Jeffrey's bedroom yielded immediate results that exceeded investigators' expectations. In a shoebox pushed beneath his bed, officers discovered Keith's designer watch and gold chain, still in the same condition as when they were taken from his body, without any attempt to alter their appearance or remove identifying features. Detective Brown, photographing the items where they were found before having them properly bagged as evidence, noted the strange juxtaposition of these luxury items amid the sparse furnishings of Jeffrey's room. A single bed with mismatched sheets, a dresser with peeling veneer, and walls bare except for posters of rap artists and basketball players. The discovery of the stolen items in Jeffrey's possession created an irrefutable link between him and the crime, transforming what might have been a circumstantial case based primarily on video evidence into one with physical evidence directly connecting the suspect to the victim. Most damaging to any potential defense was that the items appeared untouched, suggesting Jeffrey had not taken steps to sell them or otherwise dispose of evidence, indicating either a lack of planning or a desire to keep the trophies of his crime. Further search of Jeffrey's room revealed additional evidence that strengthened the case against him. In a trash can beside his desk, officers found a blood-stained T-shirt that appeared to match the one Jeffrey was wearing in the mall security footage, with initial field tests indicating the presence of both Jeffrey's blood and blood from another individual that would later be confirmed as Keith's. The hoodie seen in the video was discovered stuffed between the mattress and box spring of Jeffrey's bed, also bearing traces of blood that forensic analysis would match to both teenagers. Most damning was the recovery of the knife believed to be the murder weapon, found wrapped in a towel and hidden in the back of Jeffrey's closet. A 7-inch hunting knife with a distinctive handle that matched the glimpse of the weapon seen in the security footage. The blade, despite apparent attempts to clean it, still contained trace evidence in the hilt that DNA analysis would later match to Keith Duncan, creating an unassailable connection between Jeffrey and the specific instrument used in the killing. While the physical search continued, Detective Brown conducted a preliminary interview with Loretta Blake, Jeffrey's grandmother, who expressed shock and disbelief at the allegations against her grandson. The 68-year-old woman, who had raised Jeffrey since his mother's incarceration for drug offenses when he was 7 years old, described him as troubled but not violent, noting his struggles in school and with authority figures, but insisting he had been home on the evening of September 14th. When confronted with the timeline established by the mall security footage, Ms. Blake acknowledged that Jeffrey had left the house around 4 p.m., claiming he was going to meet friends, and had returned sometime after 8 p.m. with what she had assumed was a nosebleed. Her description of Jeffrey's injured condition upon returning home corroborated the forensic evidence indicating Keith had fought back during the attack. with Ms. Blake recalling that Jeffrey had claimed he got into it with some guys who had jumped him near the streetcar stop. The inconsistency between this explanation and the injuries documented during Jeffrey's booking, specifically defensive wounds on his hands, consistent with knife fighting, and scratches on his face, consistent with the DNA found under Keith's fingernails, would later undermine defense claims that Jeffrey had been involved in an unrelated altercation. Detective Brown's initial interrogation of Jeffrey Blake at the police station revealed a suspect attempting to maintain composure, but showing clear signs of stress as evidence was methodically presented. The interview, recorded on video as required by department policy, began with Jeffrey claiming complete ignorance about Keith Duncan or any incident at the Riverwalk Shopping Center. When shown still images from the security footage placing him at the mall, Jeffrey adjusted his story to admit he had been there, but he denied following anyone or being involved in any altercation. The tactical turning point came when Brown placed photographs of the watch and chain found in Jeffrey's room on the table, asking directly, "How did Keith Duncan's belongings end up under your bed if you never met him?" The visible shift in Jeffrey's demeanor, a momentary widening of the eyes, a nervous swallow, hands suddenly restless on the table, told Brown his suspect was reassessing his options. Jeffrey then requested a lawyer, ending the initial interrogation, but providing investigators with recorded evidence of his changing story and reaction to being confronted with physical evidence, behaviors that experienced detectives recognized as consciousness of guilt. News of Jeffrey Blake's arrest spread quickly through New Orleans, with local media providing extensive coverage that included his yearbook photo alongside images of Keith Duncan, creating a visual narrative that emphasized the tragic intersection of two young lives. The police department, recognizing the sensitive nature of the case involving minors from different socioeconomic backgrounds, held a press conference where Chief Robert Martinez emphasized that while Jeffrey was legally a juvenile at 17, Louisiana law allowed him to be charged as an adult for first-degree murder. Detective Brown, speaking briefly about the evidence that led to the arrest, carefully avoided details that might compromise the ongoing investigation, while confirming that the department believed the motive involved robbery of specific valuable items. The Duncan family, represented by their attorney Sharon Willis, issued a statement expressing gratitude for the swift police work while requesting privacy as they prepared for Keith's funeral. Notably absent from any public statements was Jeffrey's family, with his grandmother declining all interview requests and no other relatives coming forward to speak on his behalf, creating an immediate imbalance in the public narrative that would continue throughout the legal proceedings. The forensic evidence collected from both the crime scene and Jeffrey's bedroom created a scientific narrative that corroborated the story told by the security footage. DNA analysis confirmed that blood found on the parking garage floor belonged to both Keith Duncan and Jeffrey Blake, supporting the theory that Keith had fought back and injured his attacker. Blood spatter expert Dr. Raymond Owens, examining photographs from the scene, determined that the distribution pattern indicated multiple stab wounds delivered with significant force, contradicting potential defense claims of a single panicked action. Fingerprint analysis identified Jeffrey's prints on Keith's car near where the struggle began, placing him directly at the scene in a way that couldn't be explained by coincidental presence in the parking garage. Most conclusive was the DNA match between skin cells found under Keith's fingernails and Jeffrey Blake, providing irrefutable scientific evidence that Keith had scratched his attacker during the struggle, injuries still visible on Jeffrey's face when he was taken into custody. This forensic evidence, compiled in a preliminary report for the district attorney's office, strengthened what was already a compelling case built on video evidence and the recovery of stolen property. The investigation entered a new phase after Jeffrey Blake's arrest, with the focus shifting from identification to building a comprehensive case that would withstand the scrutiny of court proceedings. Detective Noah Brown, working closely with the district attorney's office, recognized that, despite the strong physical and video evidence establishing the exact nature of the connection between Jeffrey and Keith would be crucial for understanding the full context of the crime and countering any potential defense strategies. Through interviews with classmates and teachers from both teenagers' schools, investigators discovered that Jeffrey and Keith had indeed crossed paths years earlier at Roosevelt Middle School before Keith received a scholarship to the private Marshall Preparatory Academy. Several former classmates recalled tensions between the two boys even then, with Jeffrey reportedly resenting Keith's academic success and popularity. Most significant was testimony from a former teacher who remembered breaking up an altercation between them in 8th grade after Jeffrey had accused Keith of acting better than everyone else because of his acceptance to the prestigious private school. This history, while years old, provided valuable context for Keith's apparent recognition of Jeffrey during the attack and suggested the possibility that Jeffrey had specifically targeted Keith rather than opportunistically selecting him, based solely on his visible valuables. When police searched Jeffrey Blake's bedroom, they discovered Keith's $15,000 designer watch and gold chain hidden beneath his mattress, creating an irrefutable connection between the suspect and the crime. The condition of these items provided important insights into Jeffrey's state of mind. Neither had been damaged or altered in ways that would make them easier to sell, suggesting he had kept them as trophies rather than taking them purely for financial gain. Forensic examination revealed that, despite apparent attempts to wipe them clean, both items still contained trace DNA matching Keith Duncan, along with fingerprints matching Jeffrey that were positioned in ways consistent with removing the items from a victim rather than normal wear. Most telling was that Jeffrey had made no attempts to dispose of these highly incriminating items in the 2 days between the murder and his arrest, keeping them close at hand where he could see and handle them. This behavior, according to forensic psychologist Dr. Vanessa Williams, consulted by the prosecution, suggested a killer who derived satisfaction from possessing symbols of his victim, indicating elements of power and control, motivating the crime beyond simple financial gain. The prosecution would later use this assessment to argue that the robbery was merely a pretext for violence stemming from long-standing resentment. Digital evidence became a cornerstone of the case against Jeffrey Blake, with forensic analysis of his cell phone yielding particularly damning information. Location data confirmed his presence at the Riverwalk Shopping Center during the time of the murder, contradicting his initial claims about his whereabouts that evening. His search history revealed queries about how to clean blood from clothes and pawnshops no questions made in the hours following Keith's death, demonstrating consciousness of guilt and premeditation to dispose of evidence. Perhaps most incriminating were text messages sent to a friend the day before the murder, where Jeffrey had written, "Gonna come up big tomorrow," and tired of watching these rich boys flash stuff they don't deserve, suggesting he had been planning some form of robbery. When combined with the mall's security footage showing him deliberately following Keith through the shopping center, these digital breadcrumbs created a timeline of premeditation that prosecutor Ashley Martinez would later characterize as showing not a momentary lapse in judgment, but a calculated plan to target, rob, and ultimately kill a peer he had resented for years. The digital forensics team also recovered deleted photos from Jeffrey's phone, showing him wearing Keith's watch and chain in his bedroom shortly after the murder, images that appeared to be self-taken celebratory photos that he had later attempted to erase. The autopsy results provided by medical examiner Dr. Elaine Toussaint delivered scientific confirmation of the brutal nature of the attack while contradicting several potential defense narratives. The report documented 11 stab wounds to Keith's torso and arms, with 3 penetrating vital organs, including one that pierced his heart. The angle and depth of the wounds indicated they were delivered with significant force, requiring deliberate action rather than accidental or defensive movements. Dr. Toussaint noted that the fatal heart wound appeared to have been inflicted after several other stab wounds, suggesting an attack that escalated in intensity rather than a single panicked action. The defensive wounds on Keith's hands and forearms showed he had attempted to protect himself, consistent with the struggle seen in the security footage and contradicting any potential claims that he had been the initial aggressor. Toxicology results showed no alcohol or drugs in Keith's system, eliminating another potential defense angle suggesting impaired judgment or a drug-related dispute. The scientific precision of the autopsy findings, presented in clinical language and supported by detailed photographs, created an irrefutable account of a violent, sustained attack that aligned perfectly with the prosecution's narrative of a robbery that escalated to murder when the victim fought back and recognized his attacker. Motive became a central focus for investigators as they delved deeper into the backgrounds of both teenagers, seeking to understand why a robbery had escalated to such extreme violence. Through interviews with Jeffrey's classmates and examination of his social media activity, a picture emerged of a young man obsessed with status symbols and resentful of peers with greater financial resources. Several classmates described Jeffrey's fixation on designer clothing and luxury accessories, noting how he would often comment on other students' possessions and question how they could afford such items. His Instagram account, though sparsely populated with actual photos of himself, contained numerous saved images of luxury watches similar to the one Keith owned, suggesting a particular fixation on these status symbols. Most revealing was a notebook found in Jeffrey's room containing drawings of watches alongside calculations of their value and how long it would take to purchase them at minimum wage. Drawings that notably included sketches resembling Keith's distinctive timepiece. This evidence of long-standing obsession with the very type of item stolen from Keith strengthened the prosecution's theory that the robbery was not random, but specifically targeted, with Jeffrey selecting Keith as a victim after noticing his watch in the mall and possibly recognizing him as a former classmate who had gone on to greater opportunities. The relationship between Jeffrey Blake and Keith Duncan became clearer as investigators pieced together their intersecting histories, revealing tensions that dated back years before the fatal encounter. Beyond their time as middle school classmates, detectives discovered that Keith had occasionally volunteered as a tutor at the community center near Jeffrey's home, creating the possibility that their paths had crossed more recently than initially thought. Interviews with staff at the center confirmed that both teenagers had been present on several occasions during the previous year, though no direct interactions had been documented. A particularly significant connection emerged through social media analysis, where investigators found that Jeffrey had been among the viewers of Keith's Instagram stories, showcasing his watch and other possessions, having viewed these posts multiple times in the weeks before the murder, despite not being among Keith's accepted followers. This digital stalking, combined with the history of middle school tension and the geographic proximity of their homes, painted a picture of Jeffrey maintaining awareness of Keith's life and possessions from a distance, cultivating resentment that ultimately exploded into violence. Detective Brown, summarizing these findings in his case report, concluded that the suspect appears to have harbored long-standing resentment toward the victim, viewing him as a symbol of the opportunities and privileges that he himself lacked, with the robbery serving as both financial opportunity and an act of perceived equalization. As the physical evidence mounted against Jeffrey Blake, his defense team began exploring alternative narratives, leading Detective Brown to proactively address potential challenges to the prosecution's case. When defense attorneys suggested the encounter might have been a drug deal gone wrong, investigators subpoenaed Keith's bank records and phone history, finding no evidence of suspicious transactions or communications that would support such a theory. When the possibility was raised that the two teenagers had arranged to meet rather than Jeffrey stalking Keith, detectives obtained complete cell phone records showing no communications between them before the murder. Each potential defense angle was methodically investigated and countered with evidence, creating what prosecutor Ashley Martinez described as a case built like a fortress, with every possible entry point for reasonable doubt sealed off before the defense could exploit it. This thorough approach reflected Brown's experience with how seemingly strong cases could be undermined by unanswered questions or unexplored alternatives, particularly in cases involving juvenile defendants where juries might be more inclined toward leniency or consideration of external factors influencing behavior. The final piece of the evidentiary puzzle came from enhanced analysis of the mall security footage, which digital forensics experts were able to improve beyond the initial review to reveal critical details of the interaction between Jeffrey and Keith. Advanced audio enhancement of footage from cameras nearest the attack, while not providing clear speech, captured enough sound to determine that verbal exchange had occurred before the physical confrontation began. The enhanced video showed Keith's expression changing from surprise to recognition, his body language shifting from defensive to confrontational as he apparently recognized his attacker. Most damning was the enhanced footage showing Jeffrey's initial approach with the knife already in hand, contradicting his later claim that he had drawn the weapon only after Keith attacked him. The digital evidence team created a synchronized multi-camera view of the entire sequence, from Jeffrey first spotting Keith in the mall to his escape from the parking garage after the murder, providing a comprehensive visual narrative that prosecutor Martinez planned to use as the backbone of the state's case. This enhanced footage, combined with the physical evidence recovered from Jeffrey's room and the forensic evidence from the crime scene, created what one investigator described as one of the most complete evidentiary packages I've seen in a murder case, giving the prosecution extraordinary confidence as they prepared for grand jury presentation. The grand jury proceedings were brief by typical standards, with the volume and clarity of evidence leading to a quick indictment on charges of first-degree murder, armed robbery, and possession of a weapon during the commission of a violent crime. The decision to charge Jeffrey Blake as an adult, despite his age of 17, was supported by Louisiana law regarding violent felonies and received judicial approval based on the premeditated nature of the crime as established by the evidence. Public Defender Marcia Johnson, assigned to represent Jeffrey, immediately filed motions challenging both the adult charging decision and the admissibility of evidence obtained from his bedroom, arguing that his grandmother's consent to the search might not have been fully informed. These standard defense maneuvers were anticipated by the prosecution team, who had ensured meticulous documentation of every aspect of the investigation precisely to withstand such challenges. Judge William Tanner, reviewing the search warrant application and execution documentation, denied the defense motions in a 17-page ruling that described the evidence as properly obtained through scrupulous adherence to constitutional requirements, and the adult charging decision as appropriate given the calculated nature of the crime and the defendant's clear awareness of the consequences of his actions, as demonstrated by his attempts to conceal evidence afterward. With these preliminary legal hurdles cleared, the case proceeded toward trial with unusual speed for the notoriously backlogged Louisiana criminal justice system, reflecting both the strength of the evidence and the high-profile nature of a case that had captured public attention. Jeffrey Blake's journey through the criminal justice system began in the pre-dawn hours of September 16, 2022, when tactical officers secured his grandmother's home and Detective Noah Brown placed him under arrest for the murder of Keith Duncan. The teenager, who had been sleeping when officers entered his bedroom, showed little emotion as handcuffs were secured around his wrists and he was led past his distraught grandmother to the waiting police vehicle. Officer Raymond Wilson, who transported Jeffrey to the station, noted in his report that the suspect remained silent during the entire journey, staring out the window at the New Orleans streets coming alive with early morning activity. The booking process was equally unremarkable, with Jeffrey mechanically following directions for fingerprinting and photography, his expression blank except for a single moment when he asked an officer if his grandmother would be told where he was being taken. The intake photographs would later be compared side by side with his school yearbook picture in media coverage, the contrast between the smiling student and the hollow-eyed murder suspect becoming one of the defining visual narratives of the case. The formal interrogation began at 9:17 a.m. after Jeffrey had been processed, provided a meal, and informed of his Miranda rights in the presence of a juvenile advocate, as required by Louisiana law for suspects under 18. Detective Brown, who had strategically allowed several hours to pass since the arrest to let the reality of the situation sink in, entered the interview room with a deliberately casual demeanor, carrying a thin folder that suggested limited evidence, despite the mountain of information the investigation had already compiled. The recorded interview shows Brown opening with simple background questions about Jeffrey's age, education, and living situation, establishing rapport before gradually transitioning to questions about his whereabouts on September 14th. Jeffrey's initial response was a claim that he had been hanging with friends that evening, though he became vague when asked to name these friends or specify locations. Brown, maintaining a conversational tone, then asked if Jeffrey had visited the Riverwalk shopping center recently, to which the teenager hesitated briefly, before denying having been there in months. This first demonstrable lie would become a cornerstone of the interrogation strategy, as Brown methodically led Jeffrey into a web of inconsistencies that would ultimately reveal consciousness of guilt. The tactical shift in the interrogation came when Detective Brown casually opened his folder and placed a single photograph on the table, a clear, still image from the mall security footage showing Jeffrey walking through the food court at 6:13 p.m. on the day of the murder. The video recording of the interrogation captures Jeffrey's physical reaction, a momentary freezing, pupils dilating, and a quick glance toward the door before regaining composure. "That looks like the Riverwalk," Brown observed quietly. "And that looks like you, Jeffrey, on Wednesday evening." After several seconds of silence, Jeffrey adjusted his story, acknowledging he had been at the mall, but claiming he was just walking around looking at stuff, and had left without incident. Brown nodded understandingly before placing a second photograph on the table, this one showing Jeffrey following Keith toward the parking garage. "So you were just coincidentally walking in the same direction as this young man?" Brown asked, maintaining a curious rather than accusatory tone. Jeffrey's response was to shift in his seat and claim he didn't remember seeing anyone in particular, that he was just heading to the exit to catch the streetcar home. The methodical introduction of evidence had begun, with Brown deliberately giving Jeffrey opportunities to lie that could later be disproven rather than immediately confronting him with the full weight of evidence against him. As the interrogation progressed over nearly 3 hours, Detective Brown gradually increased pressure by introducing more damning evidence while maintaining a demeanor that suggested he was simply trying to understand what had happened rather than build a case. When Jeffrey continued to deny any interaction with Keith Duncan, Brown placed photographs of the blood evidence from the parking garage on the table, noting that DNA testing was already underway and asking if there was any reason Jeffrey's blood might be found at the scene. This prompted visible anxiety in the teenager, who touched his face where healing scratches from Keith's desperate defense were still visible. "Looks like you got scratched up pretty bad recently," Brown observed casually, watching Jeffrey's hand quickly drop from his face. The detective then produced photographs of the injuries documented during Jeffrey's booking, asking directly how he had received them. Jeffrey claimed he had been jumped by some guys near the streetcar stop, an explanation that Brown accepted without challenge, before asking if Jeffrey would provide a DNA sample to eliminate him as a source of the blood at the crime scene. The teenager's hesitation was brief but noticeable before he agreed, unaware that investigators already had his DNA profile from previous juvenile offenses and had already confirmed its match to samples from the crime scene. The breakthrough moment in the interrogation came not through confession, but through Jeffrey's reaction when confronted with the evidence recovered from his bedroom. When Detective Brown placed photographs of Keith's watch and chain on the table, describing where they had been found in Jeffrey's room, the teenager's composure finally cracked. The video shows him staring at the images for several long seconds before looking up at Brown with an expression that fluctuated between defiance and fear. "How did Keith Duncan's belongings end up under your bed if you never met him?" Brown asked directly, his tone shifting from conversational to pointed for the first time. Jeffrey's response, "I don't know what you're talking about," was contradicted by his physical reaction with micro-expressions of panic that the interrogation camera clearly captured. When Brown next produced photographs of the blood-stained clothing and knife found in Jeffrey's room, the teenager pushed back from the table and demanded to speak with a lawyer, effectively ending the interrogation. Brown, who had anticipated this outcome, simply nodded and terminated the interview, having successfully obtained nearly 3 hours of recorded deception and telling reactions that would prove valuable to prosecutors even without a confession. The interrogation video, while not containing an explicit confession, provided powerful evidence of consciousness of guilt through Jeffrey's evolving story and nonverbal reactions to evidence. Forensic psychologist Dr. Vanessa Williams, reviewing the footage at the prosecutor's request, noted specific indicators of deception in Jeffrey's body language, decreased eye contact when discussing the mall, self-soothing gestures when confronted with evidence placing him at the scene, and micro-expressions of recognition when shown photographs of Keith's possessions. Most telling was what Dr. Williams described as leakage, brief moments when Jeffrey's carefully maintained composure slipped to reveal underlying emotions, particularly when confronted with evidence that directly connected him to the crime. These expert observations would later be presented to the jury alongside the video itself, helping them interpret the significance of Jeffrey's behavior during questioning. The teenager's decision to invoke his right to counsel, while legally appropriate, had come only after he had already provided investigators with valuable behavioral evidence and locked himself into a version of events that physical evidence directly contradicted, creating a formidable challenge for his defense team. Following the terminated interrogation, Jeffrey Blake was transferred to juvenile detention pending his first court appearance and the formal decision on adult charging. His court-appointed attorney, public defender Marcia Johnson, met with him the same day, beginning the process of building a defense strategy with limited options given the overwhelming evidence already accumulated. Johnson, a veteran public defender with over 20 years of experience representing juvenile offenders, recognized immediately that the case against her client was exceptionally strong, leading her to focus on potential mitigating factors that might affect sentencing rather than realistic hopes for acquittal. Her initial interviews with Jeffrey, while protected by attorney-client privilege, were described by courthouse sources as challenging, with the teenager alternating between defiance and despair as the reality of his situation became increasingly clear. Johnson's subsequent motions requesting psychological evaluation and investigation into Jeffrey's troubled background suggested a defense strategy emerging around the concept of diminished capacity and environmental influences rather than factual innocence, an approach that tacitly acknowledged the strength of the prosecution's evidence. Detective Brown's post-interrogation actions focused on solidifying the already substantial case, particularly addressing the question of motive that would be critical for supporting first-degree murder charges. Additional interviews with students and teachers from Jeffrey's school revealed his frequent comments about rich kids and their possessions, with several classmates recalling his particular fixation on luxury watches. One teacher reported a classroom incident where Jeffrey had become visibly angry during a discussion about income inequality, making comments about how some people have everything handed to them while others get nothing. Most significant was information provided by a former friend of Jeffrey's who described a conversation several weeks before the murder where Jeffrey had specifically mentioned Keith Duncan, claiming that dude from middle school is always flashing his expensive stuff on Instagram, acting like he's better than everyone. This established a pre-existing awareness of and resentment toward Keith specifically, rather than a random targeting based solely on the visible watch, strengthening the prosecution's ability to argue premeditation and specific intent necessary for first-degree charges. The court of public opinion was already in session as news of Jeffrey Blake's arrest spread through New Orleans, with local media providing extensive coverage that inevitably highlighted the contrasts between the two teenagers' lives. Keith Duncan was portrayed as the promising student with a bright future tragically cut short, while Jeffrey Blake was described through the lens of his troubled background and criminal history. This narrative framing, while based on factual elements, created an immediate presumption of guilt in public discourse that concerned Judge William Tanner enough to issue a gag order restricting public statements by anyone involved in the case. Defense Attorney Johnson filed for a change of venue, arguing that her client could not receive a fair trial in a community already saturated with prejudicial media coverage, but Judge Tanner denied the motion, citing the ability to address potential juror bias through thorough voir dire. The judge's ruling noted that the extensive and unambiguous nature of the evidence in this case renders concerns about prejudicial publicity less significant than they might be in a case hinging on circumstantial evidence or witness credibility, a statement that reflected the exceptional strength of the prosecution's case even before trial proceedings had begun. As Jeffrey Blake remained in juvenile detention awaiting transfer to adult facilities following the formal charging decision, Detective Brown conducted a crucial follow-up interview with the defendant's grandmother, Loretta Blake. The elderly woman, still processing the shock of her grandson's arrest for murder, provided valuable context about Jeffrey's upbringing that would prove relevant to understanding the crime. She described his childhood marked by trauma, his father's absence from birth, his mother's incarceration for drug offenses when he was 7, and the limited resources with which she had raised him on her small Social Security income. Ms. Blake spoke of Jeffrey's early promise as a student before middle school, when academic difficulties and behavioral problems began to emerge, coinciding with his growing awareness of the financial constraints that shaped his life compared to more affluent classmates. Most poignantly, she recalled Jeffrey's bitter reaction when Keith Duncan had received a scholarship to private school while he remained in the underfunded public system, a moment she identified as a turning point in his attitude. He said it wasn't fair that some kids got chances others didn't, she told Brown, unwittingly providing insight into the resentment that may have festered for years before culminating in violence. While this contextual information wouldn't excuse Jeffrey's actions, it offered a psychological framework for understanding how a robbery could escalate to murder when the victim represented not just a source of valuable items, but a symbol of perceived injustice in Jeffrey's worldview. On September 19, 2022, 5 days after Keith Duncan's murder, the district attorney's office formally announced charges of first-degree murder, armed robbery, and possession of a weapon during the commission of a violent crime against Jeffrey Blake, with the decision to try him as an adult, despite his age of 17. District Attorney Eleanor Washington, speaking at a press conference attended by both local and national media, described the evidence as overwhelming and unambiguous, while emphasizing that the decision to pursue adult charges reflected both the premeditated nature of the crime and the defendant's proximity to legal adulthood. Jeffrey's first appearance in adult court occurred the following day, with the teenager appearing in an orange jumpsuit, his previously defiant demeanor replaced by a subdued compliance as he stood before Judge Tanner for formal arraignment. The courtroom was filled to capacity, with Keith Duncan's family seated in the front row directly in the defendant's line of sight. Marcus and Evelyn Duncan, stoic in their grief, 13-year-old Lisa clutching the charm bracelet her brother had purchased for her birthday just before his death. When asked how he pled to the charges, Jeffrey responded in a barely audible voice, "Not guilty," as his public defender placed a steadying hand on his arm. Judge Tanner, acknowledging the high-profile nature of the case and the strength of the evidence, set an unusually expedited trial date just 4 months away, citing the interests of justice and the community's need for prompt resolution of this matter. The Orleans Parish Criminal District Court building stood imposing against the gray January sky as the trial of Jeffrey Blake for the murder of Keith Duncan began on January 23, 2023, just over 4 months after the crime. The courthouse steps were crowded with media representatives and onlookers, despite the unseasonable chill, necessitating an increased security presence that included officers stationed along the perimeter and metal detectors installed at all entrances to the courtroom. Inside, the historic courtroom 4B had been prepared for a high-profile proceeding, with additional seating installed to accommodate the extensive media presence and public interest in a case that had captured national attention. Judge William Tanner, a veteran jurist known for running an efficient courtroom, had personally overseen the preparation, including the installation of additional video displays to ensure jurors could clearly view the extensive surveillance footage that would form the backbone of the state's case. The physical layout of the room created an inevitable confrontation between the defendant and the victim's family, with Jeffrey Blake entering in handcuffs and prison attire to find the Duncan family already seated directly in his line of sight, their presence a silent testament to the life he was accused of taking. Jury selection had consumed 3 days of intense questioning as prosecutor Ashley Martinez and defense attorney Marcia Johnson worked to identify 12 individuals who could impartially evaluate the evidence despite the extensive media coverage the case had received. The final panel reflected the diverse demographics of New Orleans, 7 women and 5 men, ranging in age from 23 to 71, with a racial composition of 5 black jurors, 4 white jurors, and 3 Hispanic jurors. Judge Tanner had permitted unusually extensive questioning about potential jurors' attitudes toward youth violence, economic disparity, and the culpability of teenagers in serious crimes, recognizing that these themes would inevitably emerge during the trial. The selected jurors had all affirmed their ability to set aside any preconceived notions and evaluate the evidence objectively, though several had acknowledged following news coverage of the case before being summoned for jury duty. As they filed into the courtroom for opening statements, their expressions revealed the gravity with which they approached their task, several glancing between the defendant and the victim's family as they took their seats, visibly processing the human stakes of the legal proceedings they would adjudicate. Prosecutor Ashley Martinez approached the podium precisely at 9 a.m., her tailored navy suit and measured movements projecting an image of professionalism that contrasted with the emotional nature of the case she would present. Her opening statement began not with dramatic flourishes, but with simple, direct language that established the timeline of September 14, 2022, methodically walking jurors through Keith Duncan's final hours as captured on security footage. Martinez used a laser pointer to identify Keith in still images projected on the courtroom screens, allowing jurors to see him shopping, checking his watch, and eventually heading toward the parking garage, unaware of the figure following behind him. "What you are seeing," Martinez told the jury, her voice remaining measured despite the weight of her words, "is the last hour of Keith Duncan's life and the premeditated actions of the person who would end it." She then introduced Jeffrey Blake into the narrative, pointing out his presence in the same footage, the deliberate way he noticed Keith's watch in the food court, and the calculated manner in which he followed him throughout the mall before the fatal encounter in the parking garage. The prosecutor established the central argument of the state's case that what began as a robbery fueled by resentment and greed turned deadly when Keith recognized his attacker and fought back, leaving Jeffrey with a choice that revealed his true character and culpability. Martinez continued her opening statement by addressing the foundational clue that had broken the case, the mall security camera footage showing Jeffrey Blake following Keith Duncan to his car and the subsequent attack. She prepared jurors for what they would see during the trial, explaining that while the cameras had not captured the entire attack due to angles and parked vehicles creating blind spots, they had recorded enough to establish beyond reasonable doubt that Jeffrey had stalked Keith through the mall, followed him to an isolated area of the parking garage, and approached him with weapon in hand before any confrontation occurred. The evidence you will see comes from multiple camera angles, creating a comprehensive picture of premeditation, opportunity, and execution, Martinez explained, using clinical language to prepare jurors for disturbing content while emphasizing the evidentiary value of the footage. The prosecutor then pivoted to the physical evidence recovered from Jeffrey's bedroom, Keith's watch and chain found beneath his mattress, the blood-stained clothing matching what he wore in the security footage, and the knife with traces of Keith's DNA still embedded in the hilt despite apparent cleaning attempts. This methodical presentation established the core of the state's case before Martinez introduced the human element, speaking of Keith's promising future, his family's devastation, and the senselessness of a life taken not in a moment of passion, but through calculated actions driven by greed and resentment. The atmosphere in the courtroom shifted noticeably when Martinez addressed motive, introducing the history between the two teenagers that predated the fatal encounter in the parking garage. Evidence will show that the defendant and Keith Duncan were not strangers, she told the jury, explaining their shared middle school history and the divergent paths their lives had taken afterward. Martinez described Jeffrey's documented resentment toward rich kids and his specific awareness of Keith through social media, where he had repeatedly viewed posts showcasing the very watch that would later become the target of his robbery. This case is about more than a stolen watch, Martinez argued, her voice taking on greater intensity for the first time. It's about a young man who saw another's success as a personal affront, who coveted what another had earned, and who ultimately decided that if he couldn't have these symbols of success, he would take them by force. This framing of motive elevated the case from a simple robbery gone wrong to a crime with deeper psychological dimensions, suggesting that Keith had represented everything Jeffrey felt denied in his own life: opportunity, recognition, and material comfort. Martinez concluded by promising jurors that the evidence would establish not just that Jeffrey Blake had killed Keith Duncan, but that he had done so with the premeditation and specific intent that defined first-degree murder under Louisiana law. Defense attorney Marcia Johnson approached her opening statement with the difficult task of acknowledging the overwhelming evidence while still presenting a viable defense strategy. Rather than contesting the basic facts established by the security footage and physical evidence, Johnson focused on context, interpretation, and mitigating factors that might influence how jurors viewed Jeffrey's actions. This case is not about whether Jeffrey Blake encountered Keith Duncan in that parking garage, she acknowledged candidly, but about understanding what truly happened during that encounter and the factors that led to it. Johnson introduced an alternative narrative where the fatal confrontation resulted not from cold premeditation, but from a situation that spiraled out of control when Keith recognized Jeffrey and reacted aggressively, triggering a panicked response from a teenager whose decision-making was compromised by years of trauma, instability, and limited opportunity. This framing aimed to shift jurors' focus from the actions themselves, which were largely indefensible given the evidence, to the psychological and social contexts that might make them comprehensible, if not excusable. Johnson spoke directly about Jeffrey's troubled background, his absent father, his mother's incarceration, the poverty that had shaped his worldview, while carefully avoiding language that might seem to be excusing murder, instead suggesting these factors were relevant to understanding the true nature of the crime and appropriate consequences. Johnson's strategy became clearer as she directly addressed the prosecution's presentation of motive, acknowledging Jeffrey's interest in the watch but disputing the characterization of long-simmering resentment toward Keith specifically. What you will see is evidence of a teenager fixated on symbols of status he couldn't attain, not a calculated vendetta against Keith Duncan, she argued, suggesting that the encounter in the mall had been opportunistic rather than the culmination of a personal grudge. The defense attorney prepared jurors for testimony about adolescent brain development and decision-making, indicating that expert witnesses would explain how teenagers, particularly those from traumatic backgrounds, often act impulsively without fully processing consequences. This isn't about excusing actions, Johnson emphasized, perhaps concerned about alienating jurors who might view such arguments as attempting to evade responsibility, but about accurately understanding them within the proper context. Her careful phrasing hinted at the defense's ultimate goal, not acquittal, which seemed impossible given the evidence, but conviction on lesser charges of second-degree murder or manslaughter that would acknowledge Jeffrey's responsibility while recognizing diminished capacity and lack of the specific intent required for first-degree murder. Johnson concluded by reminding jurors that their task was not to decide if Jeffrey was involved in Keith's death, which she effectively conceded, but to determine the precise nature of the crime based on all contextual factors, not just the actions themselves. Judge Tanner's courtroom management set the tone for what would be a methodically structured trial with clear guidelines established for evidence presentation, witness examination, and media coverage. Having anticipated the high-profile nature of the case, Tanner had issued detailed pre-trial orders, governing everything from seating arrangements to electronic device usage, ensuring that the proceedings would remain dignified, despite intense public interest. The judge addressed both legal teams directly after opening statements, reminding them that while he would permit thorough examination of evidence and witnesses, he expected professional conduct that focused on facts rather than emotion. This courtroom will not become a stage for dramatic performances or unnecessary confrontation, Tanner stated firmly, a comment widely interpreted as directed primarily at the defense, given the emotional nature of their opening statement. His management style reflected his reputation for running efficient proceedings without sacrificing thoroughness, a balance particularly important in a case where both the evidence volume and public attention were substantial. Tanner concluded the first morning by instructing jurors about their responsibilities regarding media exposure and outside discussion of the case, emphasizing the unusually strict prohibitions he had imposed due to ongoing coverage of the trial. The prosecution's case began with testimony from those who had discovered and initially responded to the crime scene, establishing the foundational facts. before proceeding to more complex evidence. Emma Lawson, the yoga instructor who had discovered Keith's body and called 911, described her shock upon realizing what she had found in the parking garage, her voice wavering as she recounted the pool of blood surrounding the teenager's body. The prosecution played her 911 call, allowing jurors to hear her distress in real time as she reported the discovery while following the dispatcher's instructions to keep distance from the scene. Patrol Officer Marcus Jenkins, the first law enforcement to arrive, testified about securing the area and his initial observations of the victim and surroundings, describing details that indicated a violent struggle had occurred before Keith's death. The methodical presentation of these initial witnesses served multiple purposes, establishing the timeline, introducing jurors gradually to the disturbing aspects of the case, and creating a narrative foundation upon which the more complex evidence of premeditation and motive could later be built. Martinez handled these witnesses with straightforward questioning that emphasized factual clarity rather than emotional impact, though the subject matter inevitably affected many in the courtroom, with several jurors visibly shaken by crime scene photographs despite Tanner's prior warnings about their graphic nature. Detective Noah Brown took the stand on the afternoon of the first day, beginning testimony that would ultimately span 3 days, given his central role in the investigation. Brown's presence on the witness stand brought a shift in the courtroom dynamic, his measured professionalism and clear expertise establishing him as what legal observers described as an ideal prosecution witness, whose credibility would be difficult for the defense to undermine. Martinez led Brown through his arrival at the crime scene, his initial observations, and the immediate investigative steps taken, establishing the methodical nature of the investigation before introducing the breakthrough moment when security footage revealed Jeffrey Blake as the suspect. Brown described viewing the footage in the mall's security office, identifying the moments when Jeffrey first noticed Keith in the food court, began following him through the shopping center, and ultimately followed him to the parking garage. The detective's testimony was enhanced by his ability to narrate the security footage as it was played for jurors, pointing out subtle details that might otherwise go unnoticed. Jeffrey's attention fixating on Keith's watch, his deliberate maintenance of distance while stalking Keith through the mall, and the calculated way he pulled up his hoodie before entering the parking garage. Brown's first day of testimony concluded with his description of the specific camera angles that had captured Jeffrey following Keith to his car and the attack itself, preparing jurors for the most crucial visual evidence they would see during the trial. The second day of trial opened with what many legal observers considered the prosecution's strongest evidence: the enhanced security footage showing Jeffrey Blake stalking Keith Duncan through the mall before following him to the parking garage where the murder occurred. The courtroom fell silent as the footage played on multiple screens, jurors leaning forward to study the clear images showing Jeffrey's calculated movements as he tracked Keith through the shopping center. The most damning sequence, which Prosecutor Martinez allowed to play twice for emphasis, showed Jeffrey noticing Keith's watch in the food court, his attention visibly drawn to it when Keith checked the time on his phone. Subsequent footage documented Jeffrey adjusting his path through the mall to maintain visual contact with Keith while keeping enough distance to avoid detection, behavior that security expert Tamara Wilkins, testifying after the video presentation, described as textbook predatory stalking rather than coincidental movement in the same direction. The footage from the parking garage, while not capturing the entire attack due to camera angles and parked vehicles, clearly showed Jeffrey approaching Keith from behind, with his hand already reaching into his pocket, contradicting defense claims that he had drawn the knife only in response to being attacked first. The visual impact of this evidence was evident in jurors' expressions, with several visibly disturbed by watching what amounted to Keith's final moments, while others took extensive notes about specific timestamps and behaviors visible in the footage. The prosecution strengthened the impact of the security footage through expert testimony from Dr. Raymond Owens, a forensic video analyst who explained the enhancement techniques used to clarify crucial moments in the footage. Dr. Owens walked jurors through the frame-by-frame analysis, showing Jeffrey drawing the knife before any confrontation occurred, directly contradicting the defense narrative of a spontaneous reaction to aggression. Using split-screen technology, the expert demonstrated how footage from multiple camera angles created a comprehensive timeline that left no room for alternative interpretations of who had initiated the violent encounter. When defense attorney Johnson cross-examined Dr. Owens about potential blind spots in the camera coverage, he acknowledged certain seconds were not captured, but demonstrated how the continuous movement of both teenagers through the camera fields created an unbroken narrative that eliminated reasonable doubt about the sequence of events. This testimony was particularly damaging to the defense because it came from a neutral technical expert rather than law enforcement, lending additional credibility to the prosecution's interpretation of the footage. Martinez concluded this section of evidence by playing a synchronized multi-angle view of the entire sequence from Jeffrey first spotting Keith to his escape from the parking garage, leaving jurors with a comprehensive visual record of premeditation that would be difficult for any defense narrative to overcome. The courtroom atmosphere grew increasingly tense as medical examiner Dr. Elaine Toussaint took the stand, signaling the transition to the most graphic evidence in the case. Dr. Toussaint, whose professional demeanor balanced clinical precision with appropriate gravity, guided jurors through her findings regarding Keith Duncan's injuries and cause of death. Using anatomical diagrams rather than the most disturbing autopsy photographs, she explained the 11 stab wounds found on Keith's body, identifying 3 that had penetrated vital organs, including the fatal wound to his heart. The medical examiner's testimony directly contradicted defense suggestions of a panicked single action, as she explained how the pattern, angle, and depth of the wounds indicated multiple deliberate stabbing motions delivered with significant force. Most damaging to the defense was Dr. Toussaint's analysis of the wound sequence based on blood evidence and tissue damage, indicating that the fatal heart wound appeared to have been inflicted after several other stab wounds, suggesting an attack that escalated in intensity rather than a momentary loss of control. This testimony visibly affected many in the courtroom, with 2 jurors requesting a brief recess after viewing the anatomical documentation of Keith's injuries. The Duncan family remained in the courtroom during this testimony, their dignity in the face of such detailed description of their son's final moments, creating a powerful counterpoint to Jeffrey Blake's downcast eyes and apparent detachment as he listened to the clinical accounting of what he had done. The prosecution concluded the 3rd day of trial with testimony that directly connected the murder weapon to Jeffrey Blake, bringing into sharp focus the physical evidence that corroborated the security footage. Forensic technician Marcus Jeffries testified about the knife recovered from Jeffrey's closet, describing its distinctive 7-inch hunting blade and showing how it matched the glimpse of the weapon visible in the security footage. DNA analyst Dr. Sarah Chen then provided crucial scientific testimony confirming that blood and tissue samples from the knife hilt matched Keith Duncan's DNA profile, despite apparent attempts to clean the weapon. Dr. Chen further testified that Jeffrey's fingerprints were found on the knife handle in a pattern consistent with stabbing motions rather than normal handling, directly tying him to the weapon's use in the crime. This scientific evidence was presented with methodical precision, building an irrefutable chain connecting Jeffrey to both the weapon and its use in Keith's murder. Martinez concluded the day by having Detective Brown return to the stand briefly to describe finding Keith's watch and gold chain hidden beneath Jeffrey's mattress, with forensic photographs showing these items exactly as they had been discovered during the search of his bedroom. The cumulative effect of this evidence was visibly sobering for jurors, with several taking extensive notes and occasionally glancing at Jeffrey as the physical proof of his actions was methodically documented for the court record. The fourth day of trial began with what prosecutor Ashley Martinez had structured as the definitive connection between the foundational clue, the mall security footage, and the defendant's consciousness of guilt. Digital forensics expert Dr. James Wilson took the stand to present his analysis of Jeffrey Blake's cell phone, recovered during his arrest. Dr. Wilson's testimony established that location data from the phone confirmed Jeffrey's presence at the Riverwalk Shopping Center during the time of the murder, directly contradicting his initial claims to police about his whereabouts that evening. The expert then guided jurors through Jeffrey's search history from the hours following Keith's death, displaying screenshots of queries including how to clean blood from clothes and pawn shops no questions that had been entered between 9:17 p.m. and 11:42 p.m. on September 14th, approximately 2 hours after the murder. Most damaging were text messages sent to a friend the day before the crime, where Jeffrey had written, "Gonna come up big tomorrow," and "tired of watching these rich boys flash stuff they don't deserve," suggesting premeditation rather than a spontaneous encounter. The digital evidence specialist concluded his testimony by showing the jury recovered photos from Jeffrey's phone, images the teenager had attempted to delete, showing him wearing Keith's watch and chain in what appeared to be celebratory selfies taken in his bedroom shortly after the murder. These digital breadcrumbs created what Martinez described in questioning as a timeline of premeditation, execution, and celebration that left little room for the defense narrative of a panicked reaction or impulsive decision. The prosecution strengthened their case by calling mall security supervisor Victor Ramirez, who provided expert testimony about the comprehensive surveillance system that had captured Jeffrey's movements before, during, and after the murder. Ramirez explained how the Riverwalk Shopping Center had invested over $2 million in security upgrades following a series of car break-ins the previous year, installing high-definition cameras with overlapping coverage throughout the property. Using a digital model of the mall and parking structure, Ramirez demonstrated for jurors how the system's design eliminated blind spots in high-traffic areas, creating continuous coverage that made it impossible for Jeffrey to have entered, followed Keith, and exited without being recorded from multiple angles. The security expert paid particular attention to the cameras covering the parking garage, showing how they had been strategically placed to monitor vehicles while also protecting shopper safety. When defense attorney Marcia Johnson cross-examined Ramirez about potential gaps in coverage, he acknowledged that certain areas between parked cars might not be fully visible, but emphasized that the entrance points, stairwells, and driving lanes all had complete coverage, making it impossible for anyone to enter or exit undetected. This testimony strengthened the foundational clue at the heart of the prosecution's case, the irrefutable visual evidence showing Jeffrey's deliberate stalking of Keith throughout the mall and into the parking garage where the murder occurred. The scientific foundation of the prosecution's case was further solidified by DNA expert Dr. Catherine Reynolds, whose testimony linked Jeffrey Blake directly to the crime scene and the struggle with Keith Duncan. Dr. Reynolds explained how blood samples collected from the parking garage floor contained DNA from both teenagers, supporting the theory that Keith had fought back and injured his attacker before succumbing to his wounds. The expert then presented analysis of skin cells found under Keith's fingernails, which matched Jeffrey's DNA profile with what she described as statistical certainty beyond any reasonable scientific doubt, proving direct physical contact during a struggle. Most damning was Dr. Reynolds' analysis of blood found on Jeffrey's clothing recovered from his bedroom, which contained a mixture of his own blood and Keith's in patterns consistent with close-range stabbing. The scientific precision of this testimony left little room for defense challenges, particularly when Dr. Reynolds explained how the DNA evidence corroborated exactly what the security footage had shown, a physical confrontation where Keith had fought back against his attacker before being stabbed multiple times. During cross-examination, defense attorney Johnson attempted to suggest alternative explanations for the DNA evidence, questioning whether previous interactions between the teenagers might account for the findings, but Dr. Reynolds firmly established that the blood evidence was fresh and the distribution patterns could only be explained by direct contact during the violent encounter in the parking garage. The prosecution's case took on additional emotional weight when Evelyn Duncan, Keith's mother, took the stand to identify the stolen items recovered from Jeffrey's bedroom. Martinez handled this testimony with particular sensitivity, allowing Mrs. Duncan time to compose herself as she was shown photographs of her son's watch and chain found beneath Jeffrey's mattress. In quiet but steady testimony, Mrs. Duncan explained the significance of these items, how the watch had been a gift celebrating Keith's early acceptance to Tulane University, purchased after he had admired it in a magazine for months without asking for such an expensive present. She described how her husband had surprised Keith with it after his contracting business secured a major renovation project, seeing the timepiece as both a reward for their son's academic achievements and an investment he could carry into adulthood. The gold chain, she explained, had deeper family significance as a gift from Keith's grandfather on his 16th birthday. Through careful questioning, Martinez established not just the monetary value of the stolen items, but their emotional significance, transforming them from mere property into symbols of family pride, achievement, and connection that had been violently severed. Mrs. Duncan maintained remarkable composure throughout her testimony, though several jurors were visibly moved as she described finding the empty watchbox in Keith's room while gathering clothes for his funeral, not yet knowing the watch had been recovered from his killer's bedroom. The prosecution strategically called former Roosevelt Middle School teacher Sandra Miller to testify about the previously established connection between Jeffrey Blake and Keith Duncan, providing crucial context for the motive behind the crime. Miller, who had taught both boys in 8th grade, recounted specific incidents that illustrated the tension between them, particularly after Keith received his scholarship to Marshall Preparatory Academy. She described a confrontation she had witnessed in the school hallway where Jeffrey had accused Keith of thinking he's better than everyone else because of his acceptance to the prestigious private school, an interaction that had required her intervention to prevent it from escalating to physical conflict. Miller's testimony established a history of resentment predating the murder by several years, supporting the prosecution's theory that Jeffrey had not randomly selected Keith as a robbery target, but had harbored long-standing negative feelings toward someone who represented the opportunities he felt denied in his own life. When Martinez asked if Miller had observed any reciprocal animosity from Keith toward Jeffrey, the teacher stated that Keith had generally responded to provocations with restraint, seeming confused by the hostility rather than returning it. This characterization of their dynamic further undermined defense claims that Keith might have been the aggressor in their final encounter, establishing instead a pattern of one-sided resentment that had festered over years before culminating in violence. The defense began presenting their case on the 5th day of trial, facing the formidable challenge of acknowledging Jeffrey's involvement in the crime while offering context they hoped might lead to conviction on lesser charges. Their first witness, child psychologist Dr. Rebecca Winters, testified about adolescent brain development and decision-making, explaining how teenagers, particularly those from traumatic backgrounds, often act impulsively without fully processing consequences. Dr. Winters discussed how poverty, family instability, and exposure to violence can affect brain development in ways that compromise judgment and impulse control, particularly in high-stress situations. While careful to state that such factors don't excuse violent behavior, she offered a framework for understanding how Jeffrey's background might have contributed to poor decision-making during the confrontation with Keith. The prosecution's cross-examination was devastating, however, as Martinez methodically established that the security footage showed not impulsive actions, but calculated stalking over an extended period, with Jeffrey making multiple deliberate decisions across nearly an hour of following Keith through the mall before the attack. Martinez further undermined the expert's testimony by having her acknowledge that Jeffrey's post-crime behaviors, searching for information about cleaning blood and pawning items, hiding evidence, and initially lying to police, demonstrated awareness of wrongdoing and attempts to avoid consequences, contradicting claims of impaired judgment. The exchange left several jurors visibly skeptical of the defense's psychological context argument, with one juror noted by courtroom observers as shaking his head slightly during portions of Dr. Winters' testimony. Defense attorney Johnson called Loretta Blake, Jeffrey's grandmother, to testify about his upbringing and character, hoping to humanize him for the jury and provide context for his actions. The elderly woman, using a cane as she slowly approached the witness stand, described raising Jeffrey from age 7 after his mother's incarceration for drug offenses and his father's complete absence from his life. She spoke of financial struggles raising a child on her limited Social Security income, the challenges of living in a high-crime neighborhood, and Jeffrey's early promise as a student before behavioral problems emerged in adolescence. Mrs. Blake's testimony was poignant as she described her grandson's reaction when Keith Duncan received a scholarship to private school while Jeffrey remained in the underfunded public system. He said it wasn't fair that some kids got chances others didn't. While intended to elicit sympathy, this statement inadvertently reinforced the prosecution's narrative about Jeffrey's resentment toward Keith specifically, highlighting the motive Martinez had established throughout the state's case. During cross-examination, Martinez handled the elderly woman with respect, while firmly establishing that Mrs. Blake had observed concerning behaviors in her grandson for years, including staying out late, unexplained money and items appearing in his possession, and declining academic performance, yet had not sought intervention services that were available through school and community programs. The cross-examination left the impression of a well-meaning but overwhelmed guardian who had been unable to provide the structure and supervision Jeffrey needed, inadvertently strengthening the prosecution's case about environmental factors contributing to his criminal behavior while doing little to mitigate his responsibility for the calculated murder. The defense case suffered a significant setback when Jeffrey Blake himself took the stand against his attorney's advice, insisting on telling his version of events despite the overwhelming evidence against him. His testimony began with Johnson attempting to guide him through a narrative about his background and the events leading up to the encounter with Keith, but quickly devolved as Jeffrey offered accounts that directly contradicted the security footage already shown to jurors. He claimed he had followed Keith coincidentally rather than intentionally, that Keith had recognized and confronted him aggressively in the parking garage, and that he had drawn the knife only in self-defense after Keith began punching him. This version of events was not only inconsistent with the video evidence, but with Jeffrey's own recorded statements to police and his text messages before the crime expressing intentions to come up big by targeting rich boys and their possessions. Martinez's cross-examination was methodical and devastating, repeatedly contrasting Jeffrey's claims with specific video timestamps showing him stalking Keith through the mall, following him to the parking garage, and drawing the knife before any confrontation occurred. The prosecutor then confronted Jeffrey with photographs of the watch and chain found in his bedroom, asking directly why items of purely sentimental value to their rightful owner would be in his possession if he had acted only in self-defense. Jeffrey's responses grew increasingly defensive and contradictory, with several jurors visibly reacting to obvious falsehoods, one juror even briefly closing her eyes in apparent dismay at a particularly implausible claim. By the time Jeffrey left the stand, legal observers in the courtroom widely agreed that his testimony had only strengthened the prosecution's case by demonstrating continued deception and lack of remorse. The defense attempted to recover from Jeffrey's damaging testimony by calling forensic pathologist Dr. Martin Grayson to offer alternative interpretations of Keith's wounds and the struggle in the parking garage. Dr. Grayson suggested that the distribution and angle of stab wounds could be consistent with a chaotic struggle rather than a calculated attack, proposing that the multiple injuries might have resulted from panicked flailing rather than deliberate targeting of vital areas. This testimony aimed to support the defense narrative of an encounter that spiraled out of control rather than a premeditated murder, potentially supporting conviction on lesser charges. However, Prosecutor Martinez's cross-examination systematically undermined Dr. Grayson's credibility and conclusions, establishing that he had formed his opinions without reviewing all the evidence, particularly the security footage showing Jeffrey drawing the knife before any physical confrontation occurred. Martinez further damaged the expert's testimony by having him acknowledge that, regardless of whether the specific wound pattern showed calculation or chaos, the act of bringing a knife to a robbery demonstrated premeditation for potential deadly violence. The most effective moment in the cross-examination came when Martinez had Dr. Grayson count aloud the 11 separate stab wounds documented in the autopsy, asking after each one, "Would this still be panic, doctor?" The repetitive nature of this questioning visibly affected the jury, with several members grimacing as the full extent of Keith's injuries was methodically itemized, effectively countering the defense's attempt to characterize the attack as a momentary loss of control. The final day of testimony featured closing arguments that crystallized the contrasting narratives that had emerged during the trial. Prosecutor Martinez delivered a methodical summation that walked jurors through the evidence chronologically, beginning with Jeffrey first noticing Keith's watch in the mall food court and following his deliberate actions through the stalking, attack, and subsequent attempts to conceal evidence. She reminded jurors of the text messages sent the day before expressing intention to target rich boys and their possessions, the security footage showing premeditated stalking through the mall, the knife drawn before any confrontation occurred, and the 11 separate stab wounds that ended Keith's life. Martinez characterized the crime as a perfect storm of resentment, opportunity, and premeditation that met all legal requirements for first-degree murder under Louisiana law. In her final comments, she acknowledged the tragedy of 2 young lives intersecting with fatal consequences, but emphasized that the evidence showed not a momentary mistake, but a series of calculated decisions for which Jeffrey Blake must be held fully accountable. Keith Duncan lost his life because Jeffrey Blake made a deliberate choice to take it, Martinez concluded, and justice requires that choice have consequences commensurate with its gravity. The prosecutor's closing argument was notable for its restraint, relying on the strength of evidence rather than emotional appeals, a strategy that courtroom observers suggested reflected confidence in the case presented and respect for the jury's intelligence. Defense Attorney Johnson faced the unenviable task of delivering a closing argument following overwhelming evidence and her client's own damaging testimony. she acknowledged the undeniable tragedy of Keith Duncan's death and the pain his family had endured, conceding that Jeffrey Blake had made terrible choices with irreversible consequences. Rather than attempting to refute the basic facts established by the evidence, Johnson focused her closing argument on the context of those actions and the appropriate legal categorization of the crime. She reminded jurors of testimony about adolescent brain development, Jeffrey's troubled background, and the socioeconomic factors that had shaped his worldview and decision-making. Understanding is not excusing, Johnson emphasized repeatedly, but it is relevant to determining the true nature of this crime. The defense attorney urged jurors to consider whether the evidence truly established the specific intent and premeditation required for first-degree murder, suggesting that second-degree murder or manslaughter more accurately reflected a crime born from poor impulse control and environmental factors rather than calculated malice. Johnson concluded by reminding jurors of their oath to apply the law precisely as written, suggesting that a first-degree murder conviction would require certainty beyond reasonable doubt about Jeffrey's mental state and intentions, a standard she argued the prosecution had not met despite the undeniable fact of his involvement in Keith's death. The defense closing, while professionally delivered, appeared to generate limited traction with jurors, several of whom maintained neutral expressions throughout Johnson's arguments, in contrast to their visible reactions to key evidence presented during the trial. Judge William Tanner's instructions to the jury provided a legal framework for their deliberations, carefully explaining the elements required for each potential charge from first-degree murder to manslaughter. He emphasized that while they had heard testimony about Jeffrey's background and psychological factors, their task was to determine whether the state had proven beyond reasonable doubt that his actions met the specific legal definitions of the charges. Tanner instructed jurors that they could consider only evidence presented in court, not information from media coverage or personal knowledge of the case, and that they must set aside any emotional reactions to reach a verdict based solely on facts and law. The judge's final instruction addressed the jury's human instinct to seek explanations for tragic events, acknowledging that no verdict could fully explain why a 17-year-old boy had taken another's life over material possessions. Your task is not to make sense of senselessness, Tanner told them, but to determine whether the evidence establishes guilt beyond reasonable doubt according to the law, as I have explained it to you. With these instructions, the jury was sequestered at 3:17 p.m. to begin deliberations, the culmination of 6 days of testimony and evidence presentation that had detailed every aspect of the crime, from Jeffrey's first spotting Keith in the mall food court to the recovery of the stolen watch and chain from beneath his mattress. After just 4 hours of deliberation, a remarkably brief period given the gravity of the charges, the jury returned to courtroom 4B with their decision. Court officers notified Judge William Tanner that a verdict had been reached, triggering the carefully choreographed reassembly of all parties for the announcement. The courthouse, which had been preparing to close for the evening, suddenly surged with activity as news of the imminent verdict spread through text messages and social media. Media representatives who had stepped away for dinner rushed back to secure their positions, while additional security personnel were deployed throughout the building in anticipation of potential reactions to the decision. The atmosphere in the courtroom was electric with tension as spectators filed back in, the Duncan family clutching hands in the front row, while Jeffrey Blake was brought in from the holding cell, his previously defiant demeanor replaced by evident anxiety as he scanned the room. Judge Tanner entered at precisely 7:45 p.m., bringing immediate silence to the packed courtroom before instructing the bailiff to bring in the jury. The 12 citizens who had absorbed 6 days of often disturbing evidence filed in solemnly, most avoiding eye contact with both the defendant and the victim's family, their expressions revealing the weight of the decision they had reached, but offering no preview of its content. The courtroom fell into perfect stillness as the jury foreperson, a 42-year-old elementary school teacher, rose to deliver the verdict. Judge Tanner instructed Jeffrey Blake to stand, which he did with visible reluctance, his attorney's hand supportively touching his elbow. As to the charge of murder in the first degree, we the jury find the defendant, Jeffrey Blake, guilty, the foreperson announced in a clear, steady voice that belied the gravity of the moment. She continued with guilty verdicts on the additional charges of armed robbery and possession of a weapon during the commission of a violent crime, completing the full sweep of convictions sought by the prosecution. The courtroom remained silent for a moment after the verdict was read, as though collectively processing the finality of the decision before reactions began to manifest. Keith Duncan's father closed his eyes briefly while his mother pressed a hand to her mouth, their composure remarkable given the emotional weight of the moment. Lisa Duncan, Keith's 13-year-old sister, showed no immediate reaction beyond tightening her grip on the charm bracelet her brother had purchased for her birthday just before his death. Jeffrey Blake swayed slightly as the verdict was read, requiring his attorney's steadying hand, his expression shifting between disbelief and resignation, as the legal consequences of his actions became irrevocably fixed. Judge Tanner thanked the jury for their service before scheduling sentencing for March 10th, allowing 6 weeks for the preparation of pre-sentencing reports and victim impact statements. The aftermath of the verdict played out in 2 distinct emotional tableaux within the courtroom: the dignified relief of the Duncan family and the isolation of Jeffrey Blake as he absorbed the reality of his conviction. Keith's parents embraced quietly after the judge departed, their composure finally breaking in the privacy of their shared grief and vindication. Several jurors were observed wiping away tears as they filed out, the emotional toll of their duty evident in their faces. Jeffrey remained at the defense table after most spectators had departed, engaged in quiet conversation with his attorney about appeal options and the upcoming sentencing phase, his grandmother sobbing softly in the nearly empty gallery behind him. Courthouse sources reported that during this private moment, Jeffrey asked his attorney for the first time what sentence he might face, suggesting he had not fully comprehended the potential consequences of his actions until the verdict made them immediate and real. As bailiffs prepared to return Jeffrey to detention, he cast a final glance toward the Duncan family, still gathered with supporters near the courtroom entrance, a look that courtroom observers described as containing a complex mixture of emotions impossible to fully interpret, but suggesting some dawning recognition of the permanence of what his actions had wrought. Media coverage of the verdict was immediate and extensive, with the case having transcended local interest to become part of national conversations about youth violence, socioeconomic inequality, and the justice system's handling of juvenile offenders charged as adults. New Orleans news stations broadcast live from outside the courthouse, where crowds had gathered awaiting the decision despite the evening hour and unseasonable chill. The contrasting narratives that had emerged during trial were reflected in public reaction, with commentators divided between those emphasizing Jeffrey's culpability and others questioning whether systemic failures had contributed to the tragedy by allowing his troubled background to go unaddressed until it culminated in violence. Social media platforms filled with hashtags referencing both teenagers, some calling for maximum sentencing, while others advocated for juvenile justice reform even while acknowledging the severity of the crime. Local schools announced additional counseling services for students affected by the case, recognizing that many young people had been following the trial closely and might need support processing its conclusion. The verdict triggered renewed discussion about the city's persistent issues with youth violence and the stark disparities in opportunity that had formed an underlying theme throughout the legal proceedings, with community leaders calling for constructive engagement with these challenging realities as part of Keith Duncan's legacy. The 6 weeks between verdict and sentencing saw both families navigating unfamiliar emotional and legal territory as they prepared for the final phase of the judicial process. The Duncan family worked with victim advocates and Prosecutor Martinez to craft impact statements that would convey the full measure of their loss while maintaining the dignity that had characterized their presence throughout the proceedings. Keith's father, Marcus, focused on documenting concrete impacts: the empty chair at family dinners, college acceptance letters arriving for a student who would never attend, the future milestones forever erased from their family timeline. Evelyn Duncan's statement evolved through multiple drafts as she struggled to articulate the particular grief of a mother outliving her child, ultimately creating what Prosecutor Martinez described as one of the most powerful victim impact statements I've encountered in my career. The most challenging statement to develop was Lisa's, with child psychologists consulting on appropriate ways for the 13-year-old to participate without causing additional trauma. The family ultimately decided that Lisa would write a letter to be read by her mother, allowing her to express her feelings while being shielded from the intensity of the courtroom during sentencing. This preparation period saw the Duncans continuing therapy individually and as a family, working to process not just the loss of Keith, but the complex emotions generated by the trial and verdict, as they sought a path toward healing that justice alone could not provide. For Jeffrey Blake, the weeks following conviction brought a harsh reckoning with reality, as defense attorney Johnson prepared him for sentencing while exploring limited appeal options. Psychiatric evaluations conducted during this period revealed that Jeffrey had maintained psychological distance from his actions throughout the trial, engaging in what clinicians described as significant denial and minimization that had begun to crack only after the guilty verdict made consequences unavoidable. Counselors reported that Jeffrey initially focused on perceived injustices in the trial process rather than his own actions, but gradually began asking questions about the Duncan family and expressing confusion about his own behavior on the day of the murder. His grandmother visited weekly, their meetings growing increasingly difficult as the reality of long-term separation set in, with Jeffrey finally asking her during one visit to tell Keith's parents I'm sorry, though court restrictions prevented such direct communication. Defense counsel arranged for character witnesses, including former teachers and a pastor from his grandmother's church, to testify at sentencing about Jeffrey's potential for rehabilitation, though Johnson candidly advised her client that Louisiana's sentencing guidelines for first-degree murder committed by juveniles, tried as adults, meant he would likely face decades in prison, regardless of mitigating factors. This period saw Jeffrey beginning to engage with educational programs in juvenile detention. His participation described as sporadic, but showing glimmers of the academic potential noted by teachers before his behavioral issues had overtaken his schooling. The sentencing hearing on March 10, 2023, brought the judicial process to its culmination in a courtroom even more crowded than during the verdict announcement. The proceedings began with victim impact statements, starting with Marcus Duncan's steady recounting of the concrete losses his family had suffered, from Keith's empty bedroom to the graduation ceremony where they would receive his diploma posthumously. Evelyn Duncan followed with a statement that moved many in the courtroom to tears, describing how she still found herself buying Keith's favorite cereal during grocery shopping, before remembering he would never again eat breakfast at their kitchen table. The most powerful moment came when Evelyn read Lisa's letter, which described in simple, devastating language how she had lost not just a brother, but her best friend and protector, concluding with her wish that Jeffrey understand what he had truly taken, not just a watch, but a person who made the world better. These statements, delivered with remarkable restraint despite their emotional content, created a palpable sense of loss in the courtroom that even the most clinical legal proceedings could not diminish. The victim impact statements collectively painted a portrait of Keith Duncan as more than a name in court documents, but a beloved son, brother, student, and friend whose absence had created a void that no judicial remedy could fill. The sentencing hearing took an unexpected and dramatic turn immediately after Evelyn Duncan finished reading Lisa's letter when she broke down in tears while returning to her seat. Jeffrey Blake, seated at the defense table, visibly reacted to her distress with what several courtroom observers described as a slight smile, a facial expression captured by court cameras and immediately interpreted by many present as a sign of callousness or satisfaction. Lisa Duncan, who had been watching her mother closely, saw Jeffrey's expression and reacted with explosive emotion, suddenly lunging across the gallery divider toward him while screaming, "You think this is funny?" Court officers moved swiftly to intercept the 13-year-old before she could reach Jeffrey, but not before her attempt to physically confront him created a moment of chaos in the previously solemn proceedings. Judge Tanner immediately called for order as officers gently but firmly escorted Lisa from the courtroom. Her continued cries about Jeffrey, smiling at my mom, crying, echoing even after the doors closed behind her. The judge ordered a 15-minute recess to restore order and allow all parties to regain composure, though the emotional temperature of the courtroom had been permanently altered by this raw display of the grief and anger that formal legal proceedings often contain, but rarely fully express. When court resumed after the disruption, Defense Attorney Johnson proceeded with her presentation of mitigating factors, though the incident involving Lisa Duncan had created a significantly more challenging atmosphere for appeals to leniency. Johnson introduced testimony from Dr. Rebecca Winters about Jeffrey's traumatic childhood and potential for rehabilitation with proper intervention, followed by character witnesses including his former elementary school teacher, who spoke of his early academic promise before environmental factors had derailed his development. Jeffrey's grandmother provided emotional testimony about her efforts to raise him despite limited resources and her belief that with education and counseling, he could eventually become a contributing member of society. In the most significant moment of this phase, Jeffrey himself addressed the court, reading from a prepared statement that acknowledged his actions, while attributing them to anger I didn't understand and couldn't control, rather than deliberate malice. His statement, which courthouse sources indicated had been heavily edited by his defense team, included an apology to the Duncan family that many observers described as seeming rehearsed rather than genuinely remorseful, particularly in light of his expression during Evelyn Duncan's emotional testimony just hours earlier. The defense presentation concluded with Johnson requesting that the court consider Jeffrey's age, background, and potential for rehabilitation when determining an appropriate sentence, arguing that punishment alone serves neither society's interests nor the possibilities for redemption that exist even after terrible actions. Prosecutor Ashley Martinez delivered a powerful sentencing argument that acknowledged the complex factors in Jeffrey's background while emphasizing the calculated nature of his crime and his apparent lack of genuine remorse. Martinez reminded the court of the evidence showing premeditation, the security footage documenting his stalking of Keith through the mall, the knife drawn before any confrontation occurred, and the 11 separate stab wounds that ended Keith's life. The defense has asked the court to consider the defendant's youth, Martinez stated, and indeed we should, not as an excuse, but as a reminder that Keith Duncan was also 17, with his entire life ahead of him, a life the defendant deliberately ended for material gain. The prosecutor directly addressed the incident that had occurred earlier in the hearing, characterizing Jeffrey's smile during Evelyn Duncan's emotional testimony as the most honest expression of his character we have witnessed in this courtroom, revealing an individual who remained unmoved by the suffering he had caused. Martinez concluded by requesting the maximum sentence allowed for a juvenile tried as an adult under Louisiana law, arguing that while we acknowledge the factors that shape the defendant's development, justice requires that he face consequences proportional to actions that were not impulsive but calculated, not momentary but sustained, and have permanently altered the lives of everyone touched by this case, most profoundly, the family that will never again see their son and brother walk through their door. Judge William Tanner delivered his sentencing decision after taking 30 minutes to review his notes and the pre-sentencing report, returning to the bench with an expression that courtroom veterans recognized as indicating a significant decision had been reached. Tanner began by acknowledging both the tragedy of Keith Duncan's death and the complex factors in Jeffrey Blake's background, noting that the court was tasked with balancing justice for the victim, protection of society, and the recognition that the defendant was legally a juvenile at the time of his crime despite being tried as an adult. The judge directly addressed the incident that had occurred during the hearing, stating that while he had not initially planned to comment on Jeffrey's facial expression during Evelyn Duncan's testimony, the disruption it caused made it relevant to his sentencing considerations. The court observed what appeared to be amusement or satisfaction on the defendant's face during a moment of profound grief from the victim's mother, Tanner stated, an expression that suggests a troubling absence of empathy and remorse that cannot be ignored when considering rehabilitation potential. This observation set the tone for Tanner's subsequent announcement of an 85-year sentence, near the maximum allowed under law, with eligibility for parole consideration after 40 years. The sentence reflected what Tanner described as the calculated nature of the crime, the defendant's efforts to conceal evidence afterward, and the apparent lack of genuine remorse even after conviction, while still acknowledging his juvenile status by including eventual parole eligibility that would not have been available had he been 18 at the time of the murder. The aftermath of the sentencing hearing unfolded through starkly contrasting experiences for the two families forever connected by tragedy. Jeffrey Blake was immediately taken into custody to begin processing into the adult prison system. His grandmother permitted a brief, supervised farewell before he was led away. Court observers described the teenager's demeanor as shocked despite his attorney's preparation for a lengthy sentence, the reality of decades of incarceration perhaps only fully registering as he was escorted from the courtroom in handcuffs and leg restraints. Defense Attorney Johnson announced to waiting media that an appeal would be filed based on several legal grounds, though legal analysts noted that the overwhelming evidence and meticulous trial management by Judge Tanner left few viable avenues for challenge. Meanwhile, the Duncan family exited the courthouse surrounded by supporters, Marcus and Evelyn, maintaining the dignity that had characterized their public presence throughout the proceedings while protectively flanking Lisa between them. The family declined immediate media requests, with their attorney Sharon Willis reading a brief statement expressing gratitude for the justice system's work while requesting privacy as they continued processing both the loss of Keith and the emotional toll of the trial. Willis concluded the statement by announcing the family's establishment of a scholarship fund in Keith's name for students from underserved communities pursuing engineering education, transforming their personal tragedy into an opportunity that reflected their son's values and aspirations. The sentencing of Jeffrey Blake for the murder of Keith Duncan generated significant media coverage and public discussion about juvenile justice, socioeconomic inequality, and the factors that contribute to youth violence. Legal analysts generally characterized the 85-year sentence as severe, but within expected parameters, given the premeditated nature of the crime, and Jeffrey's trial as an adult despite his age of 17. Criminal justice reform advocates used the case to highlight systemic issues, arguing that earlier intervention in Jeffrey's troubled background might have prevented the tragedy, while victims' rights groups pointed to the sentence as appropriate recognition of the permanent harm caused to the Duncan family. The most widespread public discussion centered on the courtroom confrontation between Jeffrey and Lisa Duncan, with video of the incident circulating widely on social media and news platforms. Public reaction to this moment revealed deeply held perspectives on justice, with some viewers expressing satisfaction at Lisa's authentic expression of grief and anger, while others questioned whether her actions reflected the ongoing trauma that violence creates beyond its immediate victims. The case ultimately became a touchstone for broader conversations about how communities address the complex intersection of accountability, rehabilitation, and the social conditions that contribute to crime, with both Jeffrey's actions and the justice system's response seen as reflecting larger patterns requiring societal attention beyond any individual case. 6 months after Jeffrey Blake's sentencing, the ripple effects of Keith Duncan's murder continued to reverberate through the lives of all connected to the case. The Duncan family marked what would have been Keith's 18th birthday with the formal launch of the Keith Duncan Memorial Scholarship, an initiative funded through community donations and the settlement of a premises liability claim against the Riverwalk Shopping Center regarding security inadequacies in the parking garage. The scholarship would provide full tuition for students from underserved New Orleans neighborhoods to pursue engineering degrees at Tulane University, where Keith had been accepted before his death. At the scholarship announcement, held in the garden of the Duncan family home rather than a public venue, Marcus Duncan spoke about transforming grief into purpose, explaining how creating opportunities for other young people helped give meaning to their loss while honoring Keith's own commitment to education. Evelyn Duncan, who had taken leave from her position at Tulane to focus on her family's healing and the Scholarship Foundation, announced that the first recipient had already been selected, a promising student from Jeffrey Blake's former high school, who had overcome significant obstacles to excel academically. This symbolic choice reflected what Evelyn described as their determination to break the cycle that took our son by creating pathways where desperation and resentment can be replaced with opportunity and hope. Lisa Duncan's recovery from trauma became a central focus for the family in the months following the trial, with her emotional courtroom outburst having revealed the depth of her ongoing struggle with her brother's death. Child psychologists working with Lisa identified symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder and complicated grief, manifesting in nightmares, academic difficulties, and social withdrawal that concerned her parents and teachers. The family enrolled her in an intensive therapy program specializing in adolescent trauma, while also transferring her to a new school where she wouldn't face daily reminders and questions about the high-profile case. By the fall semester, Lisa had begun showing signs of healing, rejoining her dance team, improving academically, and speaking more openly about her brother in ways that celebrated his life rather than focusing solely on his death. The charm bracelet Keith had purchased for her birthday remained her constant companion, though therapists noted she had transitioned from clutching it anxiously to touching it thoughtfully when sharing positive memories of her brother. While professionals cautioned that trauma recovery is rarely linear, the Duncan family found hope in Lisa's gradual re-engagement with activities that had brought her joy before the tragedy, seeing in her resilience a quality she had shared with Keith. The case's legal aftermath continued through the appeals process, though with limited success for Jeffrey Blake's defense team. The Louisiana Court of Appeals rejected the primary challenge to his conviction in a unanimous decision, finding that Judge Tanner had conducted the trial with exceptional adherence to procedural requirements, and that the evidence supporting conviction was overwhelming by any legal standard. The appeal had focused on three main arguments: that Jeffrey should not have been tried as an adult despite Louisiana law permitting it, that certain evidence from his bedroom should have been suppressed, and that pretrial publicity had prevented a fair trial. The appellate court addressed each claim methodically before dismissing them, their written opinion noting that even if any of these procedural arguments had merit, the volume and clarity of evidence establishing guilt beyond reasonable doubt renders any potential errors harmless. This decision left Jeffrey with few remaining legal options beyond a petition to the Louisiana Supreme Court, which his attorney filed while acknowledging the limited likelihood of success given the appellate court's unequivocal ruling. With most legal avenues effectively exhausted, the reality of Jeffrey's 85-year sentence with first parole consideration after 40 years became increasingly concrete, the judicial system having delivered its final assessment of accountability for Keith Duncan's murder. Jeffrey Blake's early adjustment to long-term incarceration reflected the complex reality of a teenager sentenced to spend potentially the remainder of his life in prison. Initially housed in a juvenile section of an adult facility due to his age at sentencing, Jeffrey struggled with the structured environment and authority figures, accumulating multiple disciplinary infractions during his first 3 months. Corrections officials noted his tendency to associate with older inmates with significant criminal histories, raising concerns about negative influences that might further diminish his already limited rehabilitation prospects. A turning point came when Jeffrey's grandmother suffered a minor stroke, the health scare apparently triggering his first genuine engagement with available prison programs as he enrolled in GED classes and requested placement in a conflict resolution group. Prison counselors remained cautious in their assessment, noting that motivations stemming from external events often proved temporary, but documented Jeffrey's first expressions of remorse that seemed authentic rather than calculated for advantage. In a session 4 months after beginning his sentence, Jeffrey reportedly acknowledged that he can't undo what happened to Keith, and expressed concern about his grandmother's well-being, statements that counselors interpreted as potential early signs of the empathy development that had been noticeably absent during trial and sentencing. While these developments offered minimal comfort to the Duncan family, they represented what rehabilitation specialists described as the essential first step in any meaningful process of accountability and change. The Riverwalk Shopping Center implemented significant security upgrades in response to both public pressure and the premises liability claim filed by the Duncan family regarding inadequate protection in the parking garage where Keith was murdered. While the mall's extensive camera system had proved crucial in identifying and convicting Jeffrey Blake, the fact that the cameras had documented but not prevented the crime highlighted the limitations of passive surveillance. The renovation included increased security personnel, emergency call stations throughout the parking structures, improved lighting, and an escort service available to any shopper concerned about returning to their vehicle alone. Mall management, working with security consultants and community representatives, developed what they called a comprehensive safety initiative that included not just physical improvements but youth employment opportunities, community engagement events, and partnerships with local schools for conflict resolution programs. While these changes came too late to protect Keith Duncan, they represented an institutional acknowledgement of responsibility and a concrete effort to prevent similar tragedies in the future. The Duncan family, while proceeding with their civil claim, publicly acknowledged these improvements as steps in the right direction that aligned with their goal of creating meaningful change from their personal tragedy. The broader community impact of the case manifested through various initiatives addressing the underlying issues highlighted by the tragedy. Local schools expanded conflict resolution programs and mentoring opportunities, particularly focusing on building bridges between students from different socioeconomic backgrounds. The Public Defender's Office secured grant funding for additional youth intervention specialists to identify and support at-risk teenagers before minor offenses escalated to violent crime. Community organizations in Jeffrey's neighborhood developed targeted programs for teenagers being raised by grandparents or other extended family, recognizing the particular challenges faced by these non-traditional households, often operating with limited resources and support. Perhaps most significantly, city leaders established a task force on youth opportunity disparities, bringing together educators, business leaders, law enforcement, and community representatives to develop concrete strategies addressing the inequality that had formed an underlying theme throughout the case. Marcus Duncan, invited to serve on this task force, initially hesitated before accepting the position, explaining that while he couldn't change what happened to Keith, he could help create conditions where fewer young people would see violence as a solution to resentment and limited opportunity. These community responses, while unable to restore what had been lost, represented collective determination to extract meaningful change from tragedy, reflecting the Duncan family's consistent emphasis on creating legacy rather than dwelling exclusively on loss. Media interest in the case resurged on the one-year anniversary of Keith's murder, with major publications and television programs producing retrospective pieces examining the crime, trial, and aftermath. The most thoughtful of these analyses focused not just on the sensational aspects of the case, but on the systemic issues it had highlighted regarding juvenile justice, economic inequality, and the factors that contribute to youth violence. Keith Duncan was remembered not just as a victim, but as a young man of promise whose academic achievements and community service suggested the contributions he might have made had his life not been cut short. Jeffrey Blake was portrayed with more complexity than during initial coverage, with journalists exploring his troubled background while still holding him accountable for his calculated decision to take another's life. Lisa Duncan's courtroom confrontation with Jeffrey remained a powerful symbol of the raw emotional impact of violence, with ethical media outlets focusing on the healing journey she had begun rather than exploiting her moment of trauma for sensationalism. The anniversary coverage, while inevitably reopening wounds for those closest to the case, also provided opportunities to highlight the scholarship foundation, community initiatives, and policy changes that had emerged as constructive responses to tragedy, creating a narrative that acknowledged devastation while also recognizing resilience and transformation. The Duncan family marked the one-year milestone with a private remembrance ceremony at their church, followed by the dedication of a memorial bench at Keith's former school. The bench, placed beneath a live oak tree where Keith had often studied during lunch periods, featured a simple plaque with his name, dates, and the inscription, "His light continues through others," reflecting the family's emphasis on legacy rather than loss alone. Marcus and Evelyn had gradually returned to modified professional routines, finding that purposeful work provided structure that supported their healing even as they continued regular therapy sessions individually and as a family. Lisa, now 14, had begun high school with improved academic performance and renewed participation in dance competitions, though she still experienced difficult days when grief seemed overwhelming. The family maintained thoughtful boundaries around media engagement, granting a single interview to a respected journalist on the anniversary, while declining numerous other requests, protecting their privacy while still sharing Keith's story in ways they hoped might prevent similar tragedies. Friends and extended family described the Duncans' journey as one of determined healing, not moving on from their loss, which remained central to their lives, but moving forward with it integrated into their continuing story, finding meaning through how they honored Keith's memory in their choices and actions. Loretta Blake's experience of the aftermath reflected the often overlooked reality that violent crime creates multiple circles of victims beyond those directly harmed. Jeffrey's grandmother, at 69, faced the likelihood that she would not live to see her grandson released, given the 40-year minimum before parole consideration. Her health had declined noticeably in the year following his sentencing, with medical professionals attributing her increased blood pressure, insomnia, and episodes of confusion, partly to the stress of both the loss of her primary companion in daily life and the knowledge of what he had done. Financial hardship compounded her difficulties as the modest home where she had raised Jeffrey now felt both emptier and harder to maintain on her limited income without his. Occasional assistance with physical tasks. Community organizations, recognizing her as a secondary victim of circumstances not of her creation, provided support through volunteer home maintenance assistance, transportation to prison visits, and connection to a support group for family members of incarcerated individuals. While some in the community directed anger toward her for raising a murderer, others recognized the complexity of her situation, a woman who had done her imperfect best to raise her grandson after his parents' failures, now bearing a burden of grief, guilt, and loss without the emotional closure that conviction had provided the Duncan family. Her situation exemplified how the ripple effects of violence extend far beyond its immediate participants, creating collateral damage through connections of love and obligation that survive even the most terrible actions. The final legacy of the case emerged through its impact on New Orleans' approach to juvenile justice and prevention of youth violence. The task force established in response to the tragedy delivered comprehensive recommendations that were subsequently adopted by city government, including expanded mental health services in public schools, additional funding for after-school programs in underserved neighborhoods, and revised police protocols for identifying and intervening with at-risk youth before minor offenses escalated to violence. The Keith Duncan Memorial Scholarship expanded beyond its initial scope to include mentorship components and summer internships, creating comprehensive support for recipients rather than financial assistance alone. The most profound change came through less quantifiable shifts in community conversation about the factors that contribute to youth crime, with increased recognition that prevention requires addressing systemic inequalities rather than simply responding punitively after violence occurs. Keith's parents became respected voices in this evolving dialogue, their unique moral authority as victims who sought constructive change rather than retribution alone, creating space for nuanced discussion where simplistic, tough-on-crime rhetoric had previously dominated. While these changes came too late to alter the trajectory that had led to Keith's death and Jeffrey's incarceration, they represented meaningful progress toward a community where fewer families would face similar tragedies, a legacy of transformation emerging from profound loss, turning private grief into public purpose in ways that honored Keith Duncan's unfulfilled potential by creating opportunity for others.